And it's Sarah I'm working with today?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. All right, Sarah, I'm ready.
Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. This is the meeting for the Subcommittee for Social Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I am Chair Aisha Goins, and we are calling this meeting to order. I first want to do a land acknowledgement. Give me 1 second, and I should have had this pulled up. I just try to make sure that we are acknowledging our Indigenous. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities of this region and recognize that that we are situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwuvi Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in, continue learning about the Indigenous people who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Mawapa band of Paiutes, and about the historical and present realities of colonialism. I'm going to call roll because I can't see anything. Committee member Kima Ogden. Present. Committee member Tina Ullman.
Here.
I am here. We have a new committee member, Brian Scott.
I'm here.
And absent today will be committee member Senator Dallas Harris. And we're going to have an introduction of our new member, Mr. Brian Scott. Oh, I guess I should read the list. Public comment. We're going to open this for public comment. Please keep your comments to 2 minutes. And if you would just come here, state your name first, and then have your comment.
I guess I'll go first. Hello guys, my name is Katrie Saunders. I've been in the cannabis industry probably since 2008, helping things from medical to retail. Then they changed the law to exclude felons. Fast forward a few years after I helped open the Source Nevada, worked at the dispensary Nevada, worked at Solar Sage. That being said, I still advocate for cannabis patients' rights for people who have been vastly affected by the war on drugs like myself. I got set up by an undercover DEA agent who posed as a sick patient in 2010. And I think 2011, we all got indicted under Operation Chronic Problem. In that, I helped over 800 patients stay protected from getting prosecuted from the federal government. In the process, I lost everything, my car, my job, my kids, everything that I worked so hard for. Then rebuilding, they changed the laws to exclude felons from working in the industry. So I find myself back at square one. Just more recently, in the past 2 months, did I land a position with Marshawn Lynch's Doty brand once to help with marketing to launch that. I've sat around while other social advocacy groups have watched me struggle in the process. I'm still homeless because of things that I've sustained being affected by the drug war, not only at a federal level, but also at a state level. And when I speak out about it, I feel like my voice is trying to be drowned out in the process, and nobody wants to really implement the things that are owed to people who have been suffered by the war on drugs. There's no Black ownership in Black communities that have been affected by the war on drugs. No Black cultivations, no labs, no delivery companies. What is owed to us and those who have been most affected by the war on drugs is definitely ownership of everything that is in existing operation. We shouldn't have to wait for another legislative session for these things to be rectified. I wanted to also speak into regards to the funding that just got passed to help with some of the issues. I think that there needs to be community-based education and programs implemented moving forward. And I also sent those to Sager Bloom recently, and I can also forward you guys a copy, because I really don't feel like you guys are getting the comment of people most affected by the war on drugs. You're just getting like corporate people and people who have already been in the industry and not really getting input from people like myself. And when I do try to show up, I get pushed to the side like I don't matter. Like I deserve ownership, my kids deserve ownership, my mom's house was raided. There's things that need to be brought to the forefront, and I'm tired of being pushed to the side. Like I demand justice and I demand more, along with the MORE Act being voted on this week in Congress. I think that it's important that I stand up for the voiceless and really help to affect change. So I'm just here to help and be a part of the conversation.
Thank you very much for your comments. Any other public comments?
My name is Sal Ali. I spoke here last time, and I wasn't really planning on saying anything this time, but after she spoke, I just wanted to say something. What she's saying, I think, is kind of true, because I don't necessarily believe that there needs to be any sort of legislative session to happen or new legislation to come forward in order to start offering more opportunities for minorities and for social equity under the current program the way it is right now. I think there's a lot of things that can be done where we can still offer ownership to people without having new legislation come forward. So I just want to second what she's saying, in that maybe these discussions can start happening more. You know, I know right now you guys are discussing social consumption, and truly appreciate that. But, you know, I believe there is ways that ownership and things can be offered, and more opportunities can be offered to people of the community without having to create new legislation.
Thank you for your comment. Will there be any other comments, public comments today? We also offer an opportunity for public comment at the end of the committee hearing. But thank you for your comment. And I know how difficult it is to stand up and say your piece, so I really appreciate you doing that. And now moving on into item 2, an introduction of our new member, Mr. Brian Scott.
Well, thank you, Chair Goings. Pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Scott. I am the 23rd and first African-American city attorney of the city of Las Vegas in its 119-year history. I am the former state bar president of the State Bar of Nevada, 2016-17, former president of the Clark County Bar Association in 2005. I have been working advising the Las Vegas City Council and Planning Commission on cannabis issues since 2014. We at the state of Las Vegas passed a consumption ordinance in 2019. The state asked that we hold off on that, on implementing ours, until such time as the Cannabis Compliance Board came into being, to get a more regional approach to the handling of cannabis consumption lounges. It took us about 2.5 years to put that cannabis consumption ordinance together. We had a series of meetings, not only town hall meetings with stakeholders, but also cannabis patients. We had it with the public, and we developed a really nice ordinance that talked about cannabis consumption. I was the diversity chair for the State Bar of Nevada in 2014, and this is something near and dear to my heart with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've had an opportunity on a number of occasions to be on the DEI panels, and so I'm pleased that you all are welcoming to this panel. And so I will hopefully be able to give you some good input from my perspective, and I welcome the opportunity.
Absolutely, and we thank you for having us. We thank you for being here. We appreciate you being here. I always say service is something that everyone should do. There's so much passion, so much joy from doing it. So
I agree.
We're going to move into the item 3, and before we start this, I just want to give the disclosure that I know I'm so nervous today, and I'm nervous not because of the meeting, but because of how important this is, not to just my community, but to the state abroad. I wasn't as nervous last meeting because I knew that it was just a conversation and I really wanted to see what everyone was thinking. The agenda has been put into place based on some of the conversations we had last meeting. And I just want to say that I don't take this job lightly, and I don't think anyone here does. And we're considering it all. And today we will be having a conversation on some things that I hope we can move forward to suggest to the Cannabis Advisory Commission. And that moves me into item 3, where we'll be discussing the criteria for social equity applicants. I want to just remind the committee that some of the things that we'll be suggesting today will set the precedents for applications moving forward. So as we're thinking about this as it relates to social equity with the consumption lounge, because this is the first time equity has been described in language, this is the ground for what could be in the future. And so I want us to be thinking about that as we're making our suggestions. So with that being said, some of the criteria for social equity applicants, let's start at what we think a minimum threshold should be as it relates to the applications for consumption lounge. So I just want to kind of expand on that a little bit. As we're building out, as we're thinking about what the application could look like and who that applicant is, I want us to consider what the minimum would look like, right? What are we saying to be a social equity applicant as it relates to, because I have the printout, I'm going to read the language specifically. I was like, man, this is a lot of work. Was I the only person thinking that? I don't have it. Can somebody give me I did print it up. What you looking for? I am looking for the language from the NRS.
Oh, section 9?
Yes.
Here.
If you could read section 9 for me. I did print it up and then.
Social equity applicant means an applicant for the issuance or renewal of an adult cannabis establishment license for an independent cannabis consumption lounge who has been adversely affected by provisions of previous laws which criminalize activity relating to cannabis as determined by the board in accordance with the regulations adopted pursuant to section 11 of this act. Such adverse effects may include, without limitation, adverse effects on an owner or officer of the applicant.
So as we're talking about adverse cannabis policies and owner, they said owner, applicant.
Yep, or officer of the applicant.
Or officer. So I know last meeting, Member Ogden was very strong about identifying who the owner, applicant, officer is and what that would look like in the application. So let's start there, if that is okay. All right, so as we're relating to the owner, applicant, and officer, what do we want to say is the minimum requirement for an owner?
I would assume they have to be over 21.
Okay, yes.
Would they have to be a resident?
So that's a question. Do they have to be a resident?
Right. Or would they, and would they have to be a resident of the United States? And I did review your YouTube video this morning. I did hear what Commissioner or Member Ogden said. I agreed with her with regard to the 51% ownership, or
Yes.
at least a majority stakeholder interest in the industry or in the industry. I did like the fact that, and I know for some of these applicants, they'll have to require partners. And they may have maybe require some money. So there may be a threshold amount of money that you'd want them to at least have available, because the type of business like this would be expensive to run and operate, at least initially. And one thing, Chair, I had a question about was because we're dealing with persons who may have been affected by prior criminalization of marijuana, would they have had to, if they were incarcerated, would they have to have that record expunged or sealed? Would that be a necessary requirement? Do you think that would be something this committee would be interested in doing, or what were your thoughts?
I have a comment, don't mean to like intrude, but I have federal charges, so mine on a state level, I'm always excluded from expungement.
I'm sorry, Chair, because I run the city council meetings, so I always have people to come up and state their name for the record.
My apologies. If you, that's okay. If just for housekeeping rules, if you have discussion items, please make a note of them, and there is availability for public comment at the end of the session. So just for housekeeping rules. To what you're saying, the state, so the policy does disenfranchise those persons with cannabis policies. And we're going, I'm stuttering because I know that this is something that should be done and this is work that we'll have to do. But as the conversation goes right now, there isn't, you'd have to be 10 years out of your cannabis infraction for you to be considered for this application.
Right, if it was a felony.
If it was a felony.
If it's a misdemeanor.
If it's a misdemeanor, then I believe we could make an exception. I'd have to look that up.
I know for the municipal court chair that we have, if there's been a decriminalized law for cannabis consumption, there's already, at least on the city of Las Vegas's municipal court website, a button or a hyperlink you can push for decriminalized crimes, and you can apply to have your record sealed or expunged.
Sealed or expunged.
Yes.
So I'm making a note to ask that question later.
Okay.
However, right now, if they're 10 years out of it, they should be able to apply.
Okay.
So, and so are we saying that would be the first criteria for owner only, member Ogden?
Yeah, but that's not I think that there should be other, ways to get in and follow the social equity, as well. But yes, I would say, convictions, prior non-violent convictions, are something that we should look at and see how to roll that in. I agree with Mr. Scott that, it needs to be addressed, to decriminalize and those and expunge those records. But unfortunately, that's not in place yet to that level, and we have to keep moving this along so they don't wait for that. But yes, I would say.
And are we saying, and member Ullman, please feel free to engage in the conversation. So are we saying that that person has to be, their records have to be sealed? No. Is that part of the criteria? No?
I definitely don't think that should be the case. I mean, we just heard from somebody who has a felony and wants to get in the industry. And if we make that rule, that will just prevent folks that have had a felony from getting in the industry. So what justice are we doing there? I mean, if we can make these new rules on this new license, let's do it. Nonviolent being the key, but why wait on some logistical thing to let somebody enter the industry? So I would say no, just nonviolent, felony or misdemeanor. And then just going back to your original question, Chair Goins, criteria for the social equity applicant, I wanted to add, the applicant has lived in a community disproportionately affected by federal or state policy for more than 3 years. And the other criteria is have an immediate family member, mother, father, brother, sister, child, or spouse who was also affected by unjust cannabis policy, which in turn affected their life. So those would be
are we talking about?
Sorry.
Are we talking about owner, applicant, and officer across the board? Because right now we were actually discussing owner. So are we talking specifically about owner? We want to say, we're thinking 3 years, you have to have lived, say it again, in a disproportionately, in an area disproportionately affected?
Correct.
Okay, I was really thinking more like 5. So I'm gonna be honest. I was thinking being a little stronger. I agree with what you're saying, Member Ullman. I was thinking 5 years. And the reason why I was thinking that, and you guys feel free to dialogue with me, is because Nevada is a very transient state. And I think to show that you are a member of this community and this state, you should have some tenure here. And I think 5 years says you have tenure. I don't think 3 years says it to me.
Sorry, Chair Goins, not how long they've lived in Nevada necessarily for this criteria, but how long they've been in a community affected by the war on drugs, or so not necessarily Nevada, because they could be from LA, moved here when they were 10 and lived in a community for their childhood.
I'm gonna push back on that. I definitely want them, because these licenses are set up for Nevada, right? For our residents. That matters to me. I think that should matter to this committee. But I, along the lines of what you're thinking, absolutely areas disproportionately affected, but in Nevada, because then it puts stress on the Cannabis Compliance Board to verify those persons in other states that were in disproportionately affected areas. I wouldn't want to do that to the Cannabis Compliance Board.
Just to clarify, there's two separate scenarios. So the first scenario is criteria for social equity applicants, right?
Yes.
And the 3 pillars that I mentioned. And then the other question down our agenda is residency. So
yes, but I'm talking
buckets.
Yes, but Member Ullman, we're on the same conversation. I'm talking about criteria to say that you are a social equity applicant. If we're talking about lived in a disproportionate area, I would want it to be 5 years that says you're a resident of Nevada that has lived in a disproportionate area.
Got it. Okay. So I also agree on the 5 years for Nevada residency, but for living in a disenfranchised community, my input was 3 years.
Okay.
Because what you don't, somewhat, I think what she's saying, maybe what you're getting at too, is regentrification, where like people move into those neighborhoods and they're not necessarily a social equity applicant, but they moved into this new, upcoming community that has been disproportionately, it has more of a history of that.
Yes.
So you can put a time frame on that, is what I think is what she's
and
I get to.
Yes.
Which I agree. Because I have seen that as well.
Yes, I agree.
Chair, with these criteria, I think there have to be measurable means to figure out how to go about doing it. Since you only have a limited number, how do you determine what area is more disproportionately affected than another area?
And I have some
and what type of
questions.
criteria do you use? Does it have to be declared that by some entity? But how do you make that determination? If you've got 10 of these, how do I determine if this person here is in this neighborhood, this person in this neighborhood? How do you determine which is the more disproportionate?
And that's an excellent question, and I actually have an answer to that because I've done some studies on it.
And I have some suggestions too. So
so as it relates to this point, right? Because we've agreed on one point, so we're talking about disproportionate persons affected by the war on drugs, and the paperwork says the proof is that we look for those over-policed areas, and that is there are studies done on that. That's not a lot of work. So what we identify is in the last 10 years, these are the areas that have been over-policed.
Okay.
And then that's how you determine that those persons were disenfranchised.
Okay.
Because over-policing directly comes from the war on drugs. So that's easy to identify, and other states have done that. So that's possible. I agree with Member Ogden that people absolutely, that's the reason why I'm saying 5 years, because I agree that people have been watching us and watching the rhythm of what's going on, and they moved here or have residents here knowing that this was coming ahead. And I think holding that 5 years says, you may have been watching the rhythm, but you missed it by this much, right?
So in your mind, what would that look like on an application? So you fill out this application, you have your name, your age, you got where you live. So do they make a statement indicating that their area was more policed than others or disproportionately affected by others, and therefore they should get?
We will identify those already.
Yes.
And those will be, like she said, in a zip code or in an area mapped out. And, but there are other measurables within that, which we can, to prove certain things, like any eligibility process.
Yes.
Which is what I suggest, and I'm sure you have a list. That's what your list is, because I have a list as well. So,
and how much weight would that be given to this type of process?
That
I know you got, at your last meeting, I know you talked about scoring.
Yes.
And the state got a little in trouble with the scoring process in the initial stage.
Absolutely.
So what type of weight would you put on to that particular portion? So
to member Scott's question, one of the things that I'm considering, and as we're talking about criteria, because I want to stay on point, I'm considering how that would be a part of the pass fail, because then what we're doing is we're just qualifying the persons to move into what would be, however they decided to sort.
Like you said, a lottery. I know you said you meant reference that on the.
However they decided to sort those applicants. This would be part of the pass fail.
Gotcha.
So you would have to identify that you are, and let's just put this down as we're moving forward. Does everyone agree that 5 years of an area of disproportionately affected by past cannabis policies? We all agree on that? Okay, great.
Yes.
Sarah, are you writing that down for me, or do I have to write that down?
I'm taking notes.
I'm asking. Thank you.
And I'd be cautious maybe about putting the word unjust and maybe just put, like you said.
Disenfranchised.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'm gonna put in 5 years here. Okay. And then moving into the next minimum threshold. So what we're saying is these are qualifying. 10 years prior out of a nonviolent felon or misdemeanor, 5 years living in an area that was disproportionately affected. These is one or the other.
Right.
You don't have to have all.
Sure. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but do you want to do 10 for felony and misdemeanors, or do you want to do 10 for felony and 5 for misdemeanor, or something of that nature? It's a lower threshold for misdemeanors. So.
10 is, you have to be 10 years out for a felony. You have to.
Right.
But misdemeanor could be any time.
Okay, got it.
Yes, and thank you for pointing that out.
And I have a question on that. So is that in our current bill that it has to be 10 years from your felony?
No.
It's not in the bill. It is the statutes of limitations as it relates to the state of Nevada.
And is it 13 years or 10?
It's 10.
Is it 10?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's not something I'm saying where the policy says it is, it's like the law of the land.
Yes.
So there's nothing we can do in this committee to make that erased so that folks.
Not today.
No.
Okay.
No,
I think
no.
The 10 years is the minimum threshold for sealing, right?
Yes.
For expungement.
Yes. I would, Member Ullman, I chased that bill up and down, paid tickets, flights, the whole nine, trying to get that changed. And, unfortunately, I would love to sit here and say, I don't want to wait till next session. But the unfortunate part is it is a part of legislation and it has to be changed in legislation, but it absolutely is something across the board everyone is looking at. And it just missed it out of session this last, this in 81st, but I don't think we'll have a hard lift in 82. So, I think we're moving along pretty well. I'm kind of proud of us. All right, minimum threshold. So let's think of, Member Ogden had a criteria that she wanted to.
Well, just measurables, like we said, some things that I have here is attendance in an underfunded school. That means you are obviously in an area that zoned for that.
Title I.
Receiving a Pell Grant for higher learning, possibly. Living in an economic disenfranchised area, which we talked about, which would be determined by zones and whatnot. Receiving public assistance is a possibility. Maybe I know in some states they do a victim of gun violence or physical violence, proving that as an obstacle in your life. That's something to consider. Obviously the prior convictions, which we talked about. Loss of housing is a possibility.
I want to start with, I I like all of those. Thank you for mentioning them. And yes, we're reading from the same playbook, which I love that. Let's start with school. You brought that up because I was considering that. I actually did a little bit of homework, and what they do call those disenfranchised schools is Title I. Yep. And so if we're considering you have attended a Title I school in the state of Nevada, if that is one of
your children are enrolled
in a Title I school in the state of Nevada. Okay, children are enrolled.
Yeah, because as yourself as an adult, you might be in a mansion right now across town. That doesn't really matter where you grew up. Not for nothing.
So you're saying if you attended school, it has to be within X amount of years of you up currently. So I graduated in 1984 from Rancho.
Right.
So Rancho may be a Title I school. I don't know if it is now or not, but I graduated blah 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 years ago, right?
No.
So you got to figure. I would not be eligible.
We're not talking
based
about
on
you, right? We're talking
no. I'm using you as the example.
No. But or anyone like you. That's the example. No. Your kids, your family,
so
where
do you
you're
have
at now.
X number of years out of high school? Because again, like you said, even though they went to a school, they may be in a better position now.
Yes.
So
and I think that there's space for that, right? So as I was considering this, to what you're saying, because we don't want to punish the folks. Hear me out.
It can make sense because
Hear me out. So let's take me, for example, and in full disclosure, I don't really personally like brick and mortar. So this isn't an interest of mine personally, but in the interest of using me as an example. When we're talking about Title I schools, and I graduated, I'm not going to tell you what year I graduated. I'm going to tell you how old I am. But if we're talking about a person who's graduated, I'm thinking along the lines of they would be 31 now. So 10 years past that, 10 years before that would be 2008, because I did the math, 2007, 2008. And you were in a Title I school for 2008 to 2018. Though that year, that age bracket, that person would relatively be 31 to 41, let's say. All right. Now, I'm past that age bracket. Let me just say that now. However, I was raised from a family that we were poor. I come from a family of 5, and it just so happened that I scraped and made my way out, clawed my way out, right? But my sisters and brothers aren't in the same space that I'm in. They didn't have the same drive. They didn't, you know what I mean? I was the person who, living off 21st Street, hood chick. I was in gangs. I am that girl. So I just made it out with the skin of my teeth. Should I be punished because I was able to claw my way from that lifestyle? I think that there's a space, if you lived in Nevada, I think there's a conversation to be made that says, we know that you were from a disenfranchised community during this time and you made it out. Congratulations. Here's an opportunity.
Well, I think that's a fine line, because some people, the point of this is to help the people who couldn't normally get in. And you probably could right now.
Okay.
And someone like you could. Now, your sister and brother, they probably couldn't supply us with one of these criteria and get in. So all I'm saying is that, to me, can kind of open the door for some manipulation.
Okay.
And that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's why I think that you have to make the criteria as clear as possible and be as measurable as possible. Because if you start going into areas that are kind of cloudy and gray, you're going to wind up where in the beginning saying, okay, what does it mean? Like one of the criteria I think on the application was that you contributed to the state.
Yes.
And what did that mean? What are the criteria for the dispensary?
You see I'm side-eyeing you. Member Scott.
I see you, but I'm still talking. But I'm just saying, but what the criteria were that you contributed to the state? Did that mean that you gave money to the state, that you your work experience has been that you've given to the state through your taxes? What did that mean in terms of you giving to the state? And that represented different things to different people. So I think that if we don't want to go down that same road with this, I think we have to have really measurable, clear criteria. So again, I don't know how many Title I schools there are in Nevada.
I actually have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we didn't plan this year.
I planned it.
So I don't know how many Title I schools there are, but again, I think you're making the pool smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think we have to maybe.
I think they have to be like at 100% of below poverty level to do Title I too, right?
There are 5 Title I schools right now.
I don't know,
That's
elementary
it.
or what level?
High school. High
Okay.
school is what I was considering, high school.
Okay.
5 Title I?
There are 5 Title I schools right now.
Out of
That's
40
weird.
some schools?
Yeah.
It used to be, well, I
Yeah.
feel like there used
So
to be.
again, I think we're making the pool so small that no one will be able to meet the standard.
And that's why I was trying to broaden it a little, right?
Right.
But to Member Scott, Member Ogden, I agree with you, that may be too broad. But then in thinking about it wholly, how do we narrow it down to open the pool?
Right.
I think taking schools into Title I schools into consideration, I think is valuable.
Right.
No one, according to my statistics, nobody has done that.
Right.
But I do think it has value.
Well, it
But
shows-
what
it
is the
shows
age
there.
bracket?
Yeah. And again,
I'd like to chime in.
I remember,
Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry, Member Scott. I agree with Member Ogden about the Title I schools. I think that is a great point. And I would just ask, would that also be 5 years, or we should probably put how long did you attend that school? And to your point, Chair Goins, about looking at somebody who came from a disenfranchised community and they could be older. We heard from a gentleman from California, public comment, who was older than me, maybe in his 50s, and now he seems to be doing better, but could at some point in his life have been disenfranchised and should get this opportunity. So I think it's, the goal of this committee is to include folks that were left out of the first round, and that really includes a broad range of folks. And we have our social equity applicants who are making sure, like, any time in your life, if you had been disenfranchised or disproportionately affected, whether you were from 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, you got the short end of the stick, right? And if you are now doing well, which we see so many examples in our community in Nevada of people who are now doing well and giving back to their community, why would we ever want to punish them for doing the right thing? So I think that it should not be a certain criteria for that, so that we don't leave out folks that maybe are older, maybe have done well and come up. Really giving everyone an opportunity who didn't to become a license holder, and ensuring social equity applicants have that opportunity. I think it really, really sucks that you cannot apply for this if you've had a felony for less than 10 years and 5 years for a misdemeanor. That's going to cut out a lot of people. So I think we need to be careful, about how restrictive we are, because then what happens is we'll forget about a bunch of other people. Case in point, Chair Goins, like yourself or someone like yourself.
So I do want to point out that we did, thank you, Member Ullman. I do want to point out that we did say misdemeanors would be any time as a misdemeanor. The unfortunate part of the 10 years is that is just the statutes according to the state. So I just want to repeat that so that everyone listening understands that. And what we are doing right now, to what you were saying, is we are building out a criteria, thinking of it as so that we're not isolating a minimum amount, but expanding it out, and how we can do that so that, because it's not just us doing the work, right? We're just making recommendations. The CCB has to look at this and say, is this possible or isn't it, right? And so as we're thinking about that, what is going to work, not just for the community at large, but for the CCB to be able to uphold it. Right. Go ahead.
And one thing, Chair Goins, is that these type of businesses may be considered a privileged license businesses under the city or the county. That person would have to qualify. A felon will not qualify for a privileged license under any circumstances because of the negative secondary effects that are deemed to be around alcohol, marijuana, or cannabis, gaming. There are certain criteria that every applicant, as you know, has to go through. And so I don't know if a felon would ever meet any local jurisdiction standards to get a privileged license.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand, these are going to be businesses that they don't sell cannabis, but they will be allowing cannabis to come in through a delivery service. Because I know in the city's ordinance, we didn't allow people to bring in their own. They had to either go through a delivery service to have it delivered, because there was always this, and I know we're not calling it black market, you have a term that was illicit market. So you don't want it coming from the illicit market. So you want to make sure that if it's coming from a licensed dispensary, it has to be delivered to that place. So that's why I'm a little afraid of doing the felon issue without having it expunged or sealed, because you won't meet the.
Okay, I have an idea. So what if we identify somebody like the young lady who gave public comment, and we're able to help get her record erased so that this doesn't stand in the way of somebody getting a license? Can we do that?
Well, it depends on how long the conviction was, or the last incident of your conviction was, right?
Yes, and I want to just kind of keep us on target here. And I'm not saying that this isn't important. It is, but we have established that there is a criteria, there is a statute, and at this point of conversation, there's nothing we can do about that right now.
Exactly.
So the best thing to do is to move forward so that we can continue with the criteria to be able to have these applications available in a timely manner, right?
Exactly.
And I know that the CCB has a time that they want this done, so I want to move the conversation back to, as we were talking about, one of the criteria being schools. One of the things Member Ogden did mention was Pell Grant. So I'm going to move a little bit away from the Title I conversation and move into, you said, if they've received a Pell Grant. I think that's brilliant. That's easy to show qualifying, right? You can just, I got a Pell Grant, here's the paperwork.
Yeah.
They did their due diligence already.
Yes. So here's the question. How many years?
I was going to say, I got Pell Grants in school too, so
You know
I want to make sure I put this on the record. I was in Upper Bound, I was in Title I schools, I was in, like Pell Grants.
Everybody gonna be looking at this.
So, I mean, so again, these criteria it has to be measurable, but it has to be something that we think is good. And remember, Ogden, you mentioned during that last meeting about you want a successful and sustainable business.
Yes.
So you have to make sure that the criteria that you're going to set forward are going to make sure that those businesses are successful and sustainable.
Absolutely.
So again, I'm a little afraid that if we put all these criteria on them, the same people that got the dispensaries are going to get the the cannabis consumption allowance.
And Member Scott, that is at the forefront of my mind as we're dialoguing, and that's one of the reasons why I am pushing back a little on some things, right? Hence the 5 years.
Right.
Because you're absolutely right. We want to make sure that we are attracting those social equity applicants that are members of this community.
Yes.
And can open up and sustain.
And
Yes.
sustain
Because at the end of the day,
issue, right.
people have to understand that, yes, you may have all these things, but you could, if you can get a license right now, could you open up?
Correct. And could you maintain it?
Could you maintain it? Could you afford to do this regardless of a grant or whatever? So yes.
And that was going to be one of my other criteria, is the experience. I know we're probably not Pell Grant, but the experience part is going to be a key thing as to what amount of experience do you have with business or cannabis or anything.
But I wouldn't want that to be a social equity criteria.
But again, if you want it to be sustainable and successful, you're going to have some, either have partners that are in the business realm or in the cannabis realm. Because I think all of us know that unless you're independently wealthy now, you're going to have some partners that are going to be involved, and you may be the equity person and the applicant, but you're going to have some kind of partnership behind you.
You're moving a little ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're on page 5.
Some of that stuff is all regular application stuff.
Yes.
And even the scoring, that's too very, you don't, depending on what all is in the application outside of the social equity piece, you wouldn't know, what the total score would be until they get everything in there and what weight this would be against that. Things like that are kind of like.
I wish we would have the application for the dispensary or the initial.
So I will.
So we could take a look at it, because that would maybe give us some criteria, Chair, that.
Well, they didn't have it in there before. They didn't really. This is.
Well, maybe
you'd be looking at down there like a blank. You would have to put that part in there. Still, it's not in there.
But
what I'll do is I will, to Member Scott's question, I can ask the Cannabis Compliance Board to give us a suggestive application. And I got to be honest, it's going to be very, very confidential.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yes,
Yeah.
Matter of fact, what I'll do is I'll ask them to give it to me.
right.
Mhm.
And then we can see what that's gonna, where already is.
And I have access to them as well.
Okay.
Just because you're.
Look, I'm like,
just because when
And I
we
do
were
as
going
well.
through the process, the city's going through the process of
look at it.
licensing the dispensaries, production facilities, and the grow houses. We had access to all that because we had to license them and we had to cite them. And that's gonna be another issue we have as well in terms of the citing of these locations because.
Let's stay on point.
Okay, I'm sorry, okay, but anyway, we can put the application, and it may be easy for us to say which criteria that we liked
Yes.
and which criteria we didn't like. And the criteria we liked, we could, easily recommend that to the.
And modify it.
Modify it.
Mhm.
And then the ones that went to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we could add those to the application.
So,
They just have nothing.
yeah.
There. Like, it was just bare.
Oh, was it? Okay,
Oh, yeah.
I didn't review them, so, okay.
Let's just talk about right now, let's talk about how we feel about the Pell Grant and using that as a qualifier. It doesn't have to be, this was no. So remember Scott said no.
Just because, Chair, I just think it's just so. Again, I got a Pell Grant when I was, but again, we have to do the school. We have to do some certain years out of school, but again, you have to be 21. So 5 years out of school, if you were 17 then, and you're just barely 21, 22 at 5 years. Mm-hmm. So is that what we're looking for? The younger, inexperienced people to get things?
So we're not necessarily looking for younger and inexperienced. There's not an age bracket except for you have to be over the age of 21. Right. We are qualifying them and we're looking for criteria that will open the application so that we're not searching for people because that's always in every state that has also been an obstacle. You've been too strenuous, so it hasn't been open enough.
Correct.
But also being able to say, hey, we know these persons come from an area that or from a lifestyle where they struggled a little, right? And the Pell Grant could qualify that. And so maybe we move past that right now, which is fine because, let's move a little past that. And then let's talk about one of the things Member Ullman pointed out is that we want to ensure that a person, as we're talking about a criteria for a misdemeanor or a felon of a past cannabis policy, that we're also considering those closely related to someone who has been affected by those past policies. Do we consider that as a criteria? Can we agree on that?
What's
so let me define. Yes.
Your third cousin on your mama's side.
No, let me define close related. Close related would be your sister, your brother, your mother, your father. That's close related.
Yeah. And we use
what about your child?
Consanguinity. That determines the close relationship you have. So that doesn't include your grandmother and your aunt and all your other aunt and that kind of thing. So
and what about your child?
Your child.
Yeah, that would fall.
But I guess I'm a little concerned with that because that's not the actual social equity applicant that it happened to. And if the whole purpose of this is to give those persons who are directly affected, I mean, yes, if your child
you're directly affected if your child went to prison.
But I think it's that person that was adversely, who spent the time incarcerated, the person who spent, yes, and I know people say that the family spends that time as well, but it's the actual person. I think we just get a lot of people abusing it if you don't set a criteria that's based upon the person and not somebody they're related to.
Member Ullman?
Yes, thank you. I definitely think that if those immediate family members were affected by the war on drugs, and maybe we make it a little bit more restrictive and did a certain amount of prison time, right? No, if your son got caught with a dime bag and, had to do some community service, is that being disproportionately enfranchised and it affects your whole life? Probably not as big as if your father or mother, brother or sister, especially parents, did prison time for cannabis policy. So I definitely think you are affected if you don't have a parent in the home. And especially if we're looking at the 1980s where cannabis and drug policy in general was so heavy and you didn't have a parent in the home for 10 years. You should absolutely be able to be a social equity applicant. The other thing I just wanted to add is, if you don't qualify, whatever if you don't qualify for social equity, our other bucket that we have here is our diversity applicants. So maybe that's the person who came from a disenfranchised neighborhood or had a parent or child affected, and now you are doing better. So we have to remember, those folks too. So maybe you don't fit in this bucket, but you fit in this bucket.
And we will, and just to what Member Ullman just mentioned, there is a space that we will dialogue about that as a second portion criteria, but right now we are focused on those social equity applicants. Right. And I also agree with Member Ullman to say that I believe that those family members, the reason why I think this way is because also the CCB can absolutely easily identify that, because you can bring paperwork that says my child, my brother, my sister, my brother. So as I'm considering, I have a ginger and my stomach's a little nauseous. As I'm considering this as a criteria, I'm also considering how can the CCB quickly identify that this information is factual. Right.
But I guess I'm concerned with the fact that you're presuming that that person's close to that family member. I think we all have family members that we're not close to. So even if it is your mother, father, brother, sister, if you're not close with those people, they just happen to be incarcerated. I guess you're getting the benefits of their.
You would have to say how your life was affected by them going to prison. And like I said, maybe we put something more specific and meet in the middle so that if it wasn't you directly affected and your direct family member was, they had to serve prison time versus just getting probation. But then that brings us to the question, well, maybe they got probation, they're still in the system, it still affected your life. Obviously, there's a whole road we could go down, but I do feel that.
And that's the problem, because the fact is, like I said, I know when we looked over these applications when they first started, how do you choose one from the other? I mean, how do I determine that you were more adversely affected because your sister was in it versus you being more affected because your brother was in it? Again, you have to look at the end of the road. You want to get people that are going to be successful and be sustainable, but that were somehow affected. That's why I think that the person themselves needs to be the person, because you're running into so many what ifs and this and that you're making it it's not quantifiable for you to defend in court. If you get sued and someone didn't get one of these, you're not going to be able to justify that criteria to a judge. So you're just simply not going to.
So one of the things that I think that when it comes to scoring, because you kind of going to that route, and I get it, but it's when you prove certain things like this, it's either you get the 5 points or you don't. Like you do fall in this, you were affected, your family member, and you qualify. Right. And yes, it doesn't necessarily, it definitely shouldn't be in an area where one out of 1 to 5, you get 3. How do I get 3 and we got 5?
Right.
Well, it shouldn't be in an area like that. It should be totally just to make you a social equity applicant.
Yes, and I want to check mark. Yes, I want to bring us back to that, and thank you, Member Ogden, for bringing that up. We are literally just talking about the criteria to qualify you as a social equity applicant.
Not scoring.
Not scoring. This is pass fail.
Right.
If you're 10 years prior from a nonviolent felon cannabis related infraction, pass.
Right. So let me ask,
if you have a misdemeanor from a cannabis infraction, pass.
Right. So is your concern more of the scoring on this? Or is it more about just because I agree as well with both of you right now. Because I'm always looking for that manipulation.
Right.
And because I was part of that process, I know what happens.
Right.
And I get that. But if it's a pass fail, if it's not part of the scoring, which it should not be, because there is room for manipulation there in that. But if that's it, then maybe it's not, it's not that complicated if it's a pass fail.
But I remember one of the first people that spoke after your meeting indicated, what if you get 1,000 people that apply for this? I know there's 10 of them. Okay, again, if the sister I haven't talked to in 10 years was somehow adversely affected by a marijuana conviction, and we hadn't talked in 10 years, so I could put that down as, okay, yeah, my sister, who I hadn't talked to in 10 years, was affected by it. Therefore, I get 5 points for that.
Member Scott, this isn't points. This is pass fail. This is a
I'm sorry. I passed that.
However, based on your conversation, as we move further into the application process, right? Because we are still talking about what this could look like. We absolutely could have them qualify and quantify what that looks like in their world.
Yeah, but to quantify, what would it matter if it's a pass
If
fail?
it's a pass fail, you just accept it as being correct.
It's accepted as is or not, because
Because
it shouldn't matter what weight.
because the application still has to go through, how do they sort them from to get the 10 applicants, right? And then how does that look in scoring process?
Yeah, but I think but again, you want to make it more where you get this many qualified applicants, rather than have this many qualified applicants, because you're never going to be able to weed that down to 10 people or 5 people. Because the social equity, they have
10.
5. Oh, they have 10 of those?
Yeah.
Okay, 10 of those. I mean, again, we got hundreds of applications for 12 spots. And so
You're going to get 100 applications for 10
right.
spots.
But yeah, and people have to realize too that there's, once they get to this part of the application process, there's I'm going off the key. So again, we just need to make sure that we have relatable, quantifiable criteria that we can back up. Because that's going to be required.
And I think that identifying a person as a personal close relative is easy to identify.
But I think his concern as well is the floodgates.
Yeah.
You know, you don't, you know, does that matter to you?
Do we really think, well, it should matter because we need to think about it all.
Right.
So yes, so then maybe for conversation's sake, then maybe we identify that we can say it can't be your husband, but it has to be your sister or your brother, or you know what I mean? Because there's also
family?
Yes, immediate family. What's immediate family?
Right, but that's that third degree cousin going in.
Yes.
That's the thing where at least it's a close enough familial relationship that you may have been adversely affected if they've been around you.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, we could put something on there that's a little more strict. Did your family member do prison time? If they didn't do prison time, how were you affected? Maybe not as much. So member Scott, what do you feel about that?
But I mean, just because you didn't do prison doesn't mean you weren't adversely
Yes,
affected. I'm the one paying bail. You could have been the one doing a lot of things that maybe adversely affected you. So
I'm for it. You're the one that's not.
You have to be careful about that.
But I do I do hear where you're coming from, Member Ullman, and in that consideration. So if we're going to say, and this isn't, we're still dialoguing, if we're going to say that immediate family affected by the war on drugs, specifically as it relates to cannabis policy, what we could do is say, we could give timeline and we could say within the years of this and this. So this way we're minimizing how that looks. So for example, I have a brother who has a cannabis misdemeanor, and his misdemeanor was from 1993. Does that qualify me today,
Right.
as a person that was disenfranchised by the past cannabis policy?
On this standard, yes, right?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
It seems
Not
like
if
it
you do
would.
the year time frame between this and this.
Okay.
And again, these criteria also have to be, they can't be arbitrary. So we have to figure out there has to be some nexus between what we're doing and what we're trying to reach.
Agreed.
So again, we have to have, again, why is 2 years versus better than 3 years versus 6 years?
Agreed.
Why isn't 1993 okay?
Agreed.
You know,
So my suggestion would be to say that we are taking those persons who are directly related to us in consideration prior to 2017. Wait, let me think.
The only thing, Chair Goins, on that is we know that there was a period of time where the war on drugs was extremely strict, but you could still be disenfranchised this year if you were in front of a judge who felt a certain type of way. I think we've already done a great job at funneling it down to non-violent cannabis offenses. Funneling it down anymore could limit how many people are eligible.
Well, what we're talking about specifically, Member Ullman, is relation. We're not talking about
Yes, no,
persons, we're
I
talking about
understand.
relations.
And we've already narrowed it down to the relation to the person who had a nonviolent cannabis offense. So,
Yes,
so
yes, but what we're talking,
Mhm.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if we put years around it, it could limit it even more. And then we'd leave out somebody who was maybe affected, again, last year.
It's very complicated when you go down this route.
Yeah, but again, I think this would be a different story if you had unlimited amounts of these. You have 10.
You have 10.
So again, I keep saying you have 10. You cannot put a criteria that's this amorphous on this project. So again, I don't agree with the brother, sister, mother, father thing. I mean, I think it has to be the person who was adversely affected, because again, that's the person who has a stake in this. That's the adversely affected person, directly affected by it.
The unjust policies still affect
doing it. It's going to, again, you have 10 spots. You have to consider that you have to funnel it down so that the people actually having to do this work and actually go through the applications have the ability to say, oh, that doesn't pass, done. That doesn't pass, done. I mean, you have to give them that ability to do that without these kind of just, gray areas that they have to be subjective.
So I agree with Member Scott. I do agree that we have to be limited because the licenses are limited, but I also want to lean in to say, I am thinking of ways, and I want us all to be considering ways we can open this up so that we're giving more opportunities. Mm-hmm. So the reason why we're considering immediate relation is because we're trying to open for more opportunities, right? And if we're going to consider immediate relations, I do agree with Member Scott again, which just let me go on record saying I do not like agreeing with Ben just wholeheartedly. I feel some kind of way about that, but I am going to agree with Member Scott again to say we want to figure out how we're going to identify that, minimize it so that we are offering the right people the opportunity. I believe that there is a conversation to be had about that. So let's give it just a couple more minutes and then we'll move on.
Yeah, but at this point, I agree as well. It's just too much, for this process right now. And
because right now I can qualify.
And we all qualify.
Right.
Yeah, to be honest with you, ain't nobody on this panel that don't qualify. So I'm about to go apply tomorrow. So how does this joking? But my point is like, I'm just joking. But my point is like, I agree with him. I think we need to just stay focused on making and allowing the people who are also going to be, going through this process, picking the people who fall in there, allow them to be successful at this, because it's very difficult when you start putting these gray areas and expanding it out to.
And then those people who are looking at the application have to use their own interpretation of what. Are you more adversely affected than you? Okay, well then I'm going to get to her since I believe she was more adversely affected.
I think it's okay, but yeah.
Just something to think about. Just something to think about, since it's all clarified now that you can't have a felony for the prior 10 years. And we just heard again from a young lady who had a felony who couldn't apply. Now let's say she has a adult child who wants to apply, whose mother was in prison, and now we're telling her, no, you don't qualify for a social equity applicant. I just want us to ponder that.
Well, the child can apply.
Right.
That's what I thought you were saying. The child, you don't want the child to apply. No, you only want.
That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we need to consider what that timeline, how we're going to qualify that. That's what we're talking about right now. So what we're saying is, yes, immediate family. How do we qualify that so that it's not so broad that anybody could, like these two sitting next to me, could apply, but that we are offering it to those persons who have been affected, who is the person that we want to apply.
Right.
So what do you think? That being said, what do you think about the had to do prison time?
I don't like that. And I'm going to be honest, I don't like it. And I can hear my community screaming in my ear right now. Like you can't hear them, but I absolutely can hear them saying, Aisha, you better not. And the reason why is because one, you can't weigh that on a person's plight. you can't weigh prison time as their plight, right? Because some people living in their home are in prison, right? Just because they're afraid to go outside. There's bullets all around them. And, you know, I want to make sure, having a heart attack. I want to make sure that as we're having this dialogue, that we are considering those communities that right now are still being over-policed for what we say is a war on drugs that has ended. So I want to be very mindful of that when we're considering all of this. But along those lines, there does need to be a criteria. I don't think that's it, but I think
you don't think the family member should do prison time, or you do think the family member should do prison time?
I don't think.
I agree with you. That should not be a criteria. I don't understand I guess, what does that give you that? So the person who does prison time is more adversely affected than the one who didn't?
Yes, if your parent or your child in prison time, you are affected. If there was not a parent in the home because your parent had to go to prison, then you were adversely affected. So, and the reason I say the prison time is a meet in the middle. So that way we know, how were they adversely affected? Well, if you did prison time, you got screwed, right? So
but I also think that a person who there's got to be so let's think of it this way. Let me shift gears. We've identified that an immediate person qualifies. Maybe what we should be saying is an immediate family member that lives in the over-policed areas. And going back to what we've said about areas that are disenfranchised.
And again, what area? Okay, in Las Vegas. What would that area look like? Oh, Nevada. What would that area look like?
That area.
Or where would it be? Can we specifically say zip codes where that?
We can, because there is studies that say that. So maybe the criteria is immediate family member that lives in an over-policed area in the last how many years? We said 5 to be a resident. So not a resident, but you had to be living in a disenfranchised community for 5 years. So are we going to say the same amount that family member has to have? Yes. Yes.
Trying to keep it all.
Because that keeps it consistent.
Again, I don't agree with the family member part of it, but I just, if that's what you guys are.
Yes. Well, I believe in the family member part of it.
Okay.
And I think those persons, that keeps us fluid.
I think I only agree with it if we can get it narrowed down to criteria to be not as, wide open. It has to definitely be zoned in on what those family members look like and how long. And
so we can say that
complicates it.
Again, this application.
We can say that right now.
So it's like, I just think, again, you're gonna have to put this broad statement together that my sister was incarcerated between the years of X and Y.
And show something.
And show something and prove it. And again, it's easy to sit here now and say that that's the criteria we want, but when you look at the applications themselves and they're this big, that's going to be the problem with this process, is that we have to make them very quantifiable and really easy to make a yes or no, pass, fail decision on.
So Member Scott, I think that looks like this. It looks like sister, brother, child, husband that was disenfranchised by the past policies, or has a misdemeanor, has a felony for the past policies, that currently has lived within the last 5 years in these disproportionate areas.
A nonviolent drug charge?
Nonviolent, yes.
Or a nonviolent drug violation?
Because that is absolutely simple to identify, because you have to have the records, you have to have your address recorded.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, I think that's simple.
I'm good with that, personally, as long as it stays like.
Yeah, because that also holds you like,
Yeah.
And I think it opens it up a little broader to those family members.
Right. But again, like
and stays consistent with what we've already said.
I just know that my office had probably 30,000 of those. And so I just know that
is a big
that's
opener.
30,000 plus, that we could currently expunge from our records. It's 30,000 of those. And so again, the criteria to me is too broad when you start bringing in mother, father, sister, brother. But again,
All those people can
that
apply, but they don't necessarily can apply for the rest. Like, there's still a whole application.
right. Or
You gotta-
again, they may
that's
not
just
meet
one.
they may not
They
meet
might not
the
even
other
have the money.
criteria. Correct. Or they may
They
not
still gotta have
meet
the money.
Just to qualify.
Yeah, you know,
Yes,
all of that.
just
The
qualify.
CCP will vet after the lottery.
Yes. And I think that stays consistent with what we've already said and opens it up to those family members.
See, but
And immediate, I'm gonna identify this again.
right.
Immediate is husband, wife, sister, brother, mom, or dad, because that puts the children, because mom and dad. Yes.
I'm just Googling what third degree consanguine anything, because that'll tell you what it is. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I'll just leave it at that.
But I think if we say if we say all of those things in congruent with what we've already said, then it holds us accountable to being consistent, but then also opening up.
Right.
And so that's yes.
Okay.
I feel good about that. And I also feel good because that is 4 criteria. I think that's a good start. We have identified, the only thing we have not identified is income level.
Well,
Or we don't have to consider it.
but I think you're good, again, in order to be, I keep going back to Commissioner Ogden's, successful and sustainable, you're gonna have to have something.
Yes.
Because again, these are, and again, I have to come from my experience of doing these since 2014, when we did all the dispensaries and everything else. And then because of our own consumption ordinance, where, the updraft system alone is gonna cost you over $100,000.
Yes, we do.
So you're gonna have to come with a partner that has some cash behind them, or you're gonna have some cash behind you.
Now,
So regardless of who you're gonna.
you can still do low income criteria, but they gotta get funding and show grant and things. They can show their own, because like you said, they're gonna partner with people. You gotta still show.
Yes.
I'm sure part of the application will still be showing, a certain amount of finances.
Yes.
And financial statements and funding, whether that be through a grant or some other process that we suggest, because
Right.
that's one of the suggestions we had last time,
I remember hearing
programs from taxes,
Yes.
not from the dispensaries.
Yeah, but I don't know what kind of
But
grants you're gonna get for this,
that's
but I
what
know
you-
that the criteria for dispensary
but-
is $250, and that's too high for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
So those are other barriers. So basically, I just, you can still do low income. They just still have to fund their business like anybody else.
Are we gonna say, so I wanna just kind of lean in here. I don't think poor people or only people should be able to get these applications. So
Mhm.
that I just want to
Okay.
state that for the record.
Right.
But if we're going to talk about income level, I want to be very mindful of how this could show up, because we're only talking about criteria. This is still pass or fail. We don't have to have an income level. I want to say that. You don't have to make under 400,000 or whatever the federal level of low income is. And I think that's like 50,000 with one child or something like that. So we don't have to say that you have, and I honestly don't think it's a reasonable criteria personally. I just wanted to address it for the record because I have it. And if we all agree, we'll move past it and we'll go on to how this look, because this is owners and I want to just kind of address it for applicant and officer. So I want to just keep us on track, but this is for application. If we're all in agreement that we can move past income level, you agree? You agree? You agree? Okay, great. Oh, good. I was like, I don't want to.
You gotta win.
Yes, gotta win. Woo! All right. So we just talked about social equity applicants as it relates to ownership. I want to talk about this as it relates to officers. And if we can, try to, I know I don't want to do anything really quick, but which brings me back to what Member Ogden said in last meeting. She said, she said officers should not have the same relevance as an owner.
No.
That is some BS.
Did I say that?
You did say that. And I was very proud of you. So I want to have this discussion now
Yes.
as we're looking at applications and we're considering what that looks like for the Cannabis Compliance Board, because we are just advisors. We're just making, offering them some advice. An owner would be the person that's on the, because I think it's important that everyone understands this, that an owner would be the person that's on the LLC. They would be the person who is making the decisions, who is helping with the money, who is saying, well, who's who and what's what, right? We're saying that that has nothing to do with a managing contract.
No.
Because that's also.
Yeah, no. So yeah, they have to have control, business control.
Okay.
So that's why with the 51% minimum, they have to have business control. And it could be more than one owner on, when you set up your LLC, you sometimes you have 2 or 3 people on there, but the person who's getting the social equity piece needs to at least be the 51% with business control.
So here's a question, because you just brought something up that I wanted to make sure that we talked about. When we're talking about, a social equity applicant, it could be multiple social equity applicants on an LLC. And what we're saying is those applicants combined have to have 51%.
Yeah, whatever qualifies them to be the social equity applicant, which is all those things, it still has to be 51% of the application.
I want to make sure that I'm being clear because this is math. So if we have 3 we have 3 persons on the LLC. Those 3, let me say it differently. There's 5 people on the LLC. Those 3 persons are social equity applicants. They have to, the 3 of them have 51% of the application.
If all 3 are minority social equity
have meet the criteria
and combined equity, okay. And if one drops, they lose their social equity status unless they have the person that's qualified.
And
because words matter.
And that could be the problem.
Yes.
And that could be the very problem, Chair, that you've identified. It's like, and that's what happened during the dispensary and the other phases, is that people got mad at each other and they dropped out and then they didn't meet their criteria, or they got mad. And this is before the time that you could actually even sell your license, where even if you died, you still have to stay on the license.
Yes.
That we need to make a criteria where maybe it's just one person.
Okay.
Rather than try to do, you got 10 people and each of them have 5% interest or 5.5%.
Because words matter.
Interest, yes.
Because if we don't say, it could be.
Yeah.
So 51.
Yeah, because I think we all know, again, maybe I don't know, but the person who's going to apply for this is going to have partners that may not be social equity people.
Yes.
And so they're going to require their funds, and this person's either going to be the straw person or they're going to be the majority owner. And they're going to run.
Okay.
So, and hopefully that person will be the key employee. That'll be the person they go to if there's issues and that.
So that's the criteria. That's one of the criteria. So now we have 5 criteria for ownership.
So I just want to chime in on that 51%, Chair Goins. I agree. I said 51%. I actually didn't consider multiple, as Member Ogden pointed out. And I think there's something to look at when it's saying that, especially for sustainability purposes. Let's say you do have 3 or 2 or whatever, multiple social equity applicants, and they equal 51%. Could that business be more sustainable? Maybe for that particular that business model, maybe they have those 3 people. So I think it's important that 51% ownership, and then it's up to that business how that looks to them. Could be 1 person, could be 2, could be 5.
No, I think what he's saying is right.
We had some trouble with that in the beginning. And again, whenever money's involved, people have a tendency to be not as nice. And so sometimes when you and I agree, let's partner up. Then when the money comes then the money comes around, then we may have a little.
Are you talking about Chair? Member Scott? Are you talking about a social equity applicant and a non-social equity applicant partnering up?
No, I'm talking about if you put together 5 social equity applicants that equaled up to 51%, and then one of them fell out, you're now under the 51%. So that's why I said it's easier to have one person be that 51% owner rather than having 5 and 6 and 7, because business disputes happen every day and someone winds up dropping out. And so
he's right too, that it does that happens a lot in both social equity and non-social equity. That happens, and he's right. If you have 10 people, I didn't even think of that, like right then, and everyone has 10% just to make up this social equity piece, then one person drops and then everybody loses it. So you don't want to set people up to fail that way.
No.
He's saying, you want to set the criteria to where one person is required to be this person. Let that one person apply for the group.
Right, and they can have 30 people behind them,
and they
but
can
at least
have
just one
whatever.
person.
And so that's where we're at.
Do you think it should be two people? So partners, husband and wife.
Just one person.
I agree.
Just one.
I agree with
Okay.
one person. Yeah,
Just one.
I agree. One person is a qualified applicant. You can have as many people as you want on the application, but one person qualifies as the social equity applicant. And they have to obtain 51%. How they work that out outside of that has nothing to do with us, but that makes this, because I know that when you add more cooks to the soup, it gets all messy. So, yes, that 51%, one person, social equity applicant.
Yeah.
Now, how does that look for officers? Well, let me say it this way. Do we want to consider officers as?
No.
What was Mr. Quinn?
I just want to, I just want to remind the people that are here with us, we appreciate you being here. I know it's a tiring process to watch. Please keep note of your public comments and have them available at the end of the committee meeting. Do we want to consider officers as social equity? Let me say it. Let me finish this. Do we want to consider officers as the same level of criteria for social equity applicants?
No.
Okay.
Not at
Member
all.
Scott, Member Oldham. All right. I agree. I just, you know what I mean? People
That's where all
tell
the
me
trickery came in last time. All the trickery came from officers, I feel like.
Yeah, definitely.
I get you. Again, you want to make sure these are going to be sustainable businesses. And again, there's a lot of kind of messes that can go along with having too many people in the.
I wouldn't even put the social equity part on the board. Like let them rank the board piece as a board piece. However they decide to do that. Like that's just, you mean after, but the equity person has to. No equity, anything to do with this board.
Officers.
They just have.
She's talking about,
the officer.
Board officers of their board. So, however that's measured, it should just be based on whatever measurement they have in place for what they're looking for board members, but nothing to do with this.
So I do just want to point out that the policy says that they should have weight. If you could read the last line again, please, Member Scott. All
such adverse effects may include, without limitations, adverse effects on an owner or officer of the applicant.
So
we can't recommend that they just don't have weight on this part.
Well, it says or, so I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be.
It says or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, then yes, all right.
Owner or officer.
Words matter.
Words matter.
Words matter, man.
All right, so I think, so we have 5 criteria for applicants that we want to submit to the Cannabis Advisory Committee to vote on. Do we agree?
Yes.
Oh.
You need to decide?
No. That's just what we came up with.
Okay.
No, but congratulations. We are making our first, we're making our first what do we call it? Suggestion. So I'm excited about that. All right. Now let's move on to minimum percentage of ownership to qualify social equity applicant. We said 51%. Minimum percentage of profits to qualify as a social equity applicant.
Yeah, that we can't, and that's gonna be hard to get behind because profits that's gonna be a kind of a private agreement between the parties. And so I don't know if we can,
Yeah,
I don't
how
think you
did
do
that
that
come into the
on a monthly
how did that-
basis.
It came into the conversation because of officers.
Well, we
So
just trying to
obviously-
X that out. So.
Absolutely.
We're trying to-
But to your question, to member Ogden's question, how come this is an agenda item? It's an agenda item because the bill read owners and officers. And so because of that, I wanted to make sure that we were having the conversation if we had chosen to talk about officers.
Right.
So since we have not, we can move past minimum percentage
Sounds wonderful.
of profits.
Because I can
qualified.
imagine if I'm the person behind the person who's applying for this, I should be getting the lion's share of the profits. But again, is that going to be something we want to see? Is that something that you're going to be satisfied with as being a social equity applicant who's getting his or her fair share of this industry? Is that something you want to see? Because you're going to see a lot of people who probably, are wealthy who are going to get either just have a strong person in front, and that person's still not going to get.
Well, that's why we're
their fair
trying
day.
to set these criteria really well so that they can avoid as much manipulation as possible. But at the same time, I think to her point, this is not I think it would be if this was a board member, what percentage of the business do they get, or how much money do they get being on the board, and what does that look like? Suddenly the board member gets 70% of profit.
Well, yeah,
like, you're really not a board member.
if you're the 51% equity, social equity applicant, you may only be getting 5% of the actual profits.
Absolutely. And
Because if I'm putting up all the money and you and I are partners because you're the social equity applicant,
yes,
I'm getting 95% of the money, you're getting 5%, so you're still not really in the business.
So
you're just kind of in the business in name only.
So we could make a suggestion for the application process, because we're talking about, we can absolutely talk about the application process for this item specifically. There is a space to say that we would like to make a suggestion that the CCB require that the 51% social equity applicant receives blank of the profit.
But you'd have to check that every day.
I wouldn't do that.
It's difficult for you to quantify that on a monthly basis, how much profit they're making. Is that social equity applicant getting the lion's share of those profits?
But
You'd have to check that there's no way for you to audit that every day.
But we wouldn't have to check it every day, to what you're saying, Member Scott, because what you would require is that you would require a copy of the membership agreement.
Right.
Yeah.
And a copy of the membership agreement would say that this social equity applicant will receive this amount of profit. I don't care how much money they lost.
And once I got this, I would change the agreement.
You know what? Basically, you can keep it, if you really need to be simple about it, it'd be the 51% and 51% of
Okay, my point
ownership.
is, I guess you can't really look behind the curtain. You gotta just go 51%, and then you leave the rest to them.
Well,
That's the way it's going to be, because no one's going to show you on a daily basis their profit splitting. And if I'm putting up all the money, that's certainly not going to give you 9%.
Well, but I beg to differ, because this is 10 applicants. And the CCB absolutely, right now, they check to see how much you're paying per pound. So why couldn't they check to see how much? And I'm just pushing a little.
Yes.
If there's a management agreement,
the seed to sale is heavily regulated. So they know how much seeds come in, and they know how much sales going out. There's no way to determine on a regular basis that these loungers are making X dollars per day, and that you're getting, or month, and you're getting X profit.
So can I say, let me just say something real quick. What they probably are trying to see, because this is what's happened in other states, they want to get the operating agreement that you have on the back end, just to make sure that the manipulation is not happening. Like the 51% that you just described, and yet they're only getting 5%. They want to see that you truly have control of the company as written out that way, and the operating agreement. So that's all it would take. They don't monitor it from that point on. Now, if you change the operating agreement later and someone reports that, and you didn't report that or make those changes, then you can.
But no one's ever going to know that, because the fact is that these agreements aren't filed anywhere. The agreement that you and I have for splitting profits is between you and me. No one else is going to, unless they're required to file that somewhere. And
They
again,
were required to turn it in with their application.
the paper may not reflect what's actually happening in the business end.
Yes, but I think there's a space to say to what you're saying, Member Ogden and Member Scott. I think, and I heard you, Member Ullman, just 1 second. I think there is a space to say that we could hold those officers and those investors accountable to having an operation agreement on file. I think.
Oh, no, you can.
And I don't think that we are asking too much. I even to what you're saying, I can hear you lawyering me. I can hear you. And I have all my all my friends are lawyers, so I can hear you lawyering me. However, I still believe that we should ask for an operation agreement. I do know that it can be changed. I do realize that. However, there is some accountability to it.
Right. And what percentage? Again, if I'm the 51% equity applicant, I'm putting up 5% of the money. You're putting up 95% of the money.
That's the question.
So the profit agreement says what?
That's the question.
That you get the majority of the profits and I don't. If I put up 95% of the money.
What were you going to say, Member Ullman?
Thank you, Chair Goying. So I do think that there's so many different business models that once someone is selected and they are one of the 10 applicants, just as we've discussed, you submit your your operating agreement to the CCB. The CCB then looks at that to make sure that you're not getting taken advantage of, but how the business sets the profits up or whatever investment they have would be up to them. We just want to make sure that they are not taken advantage of. So I think I would say that we don't put anything on this, let the market develop how it needs to, and we ensure that the 51% ownership, that's the most important part. And the operating agreement.
And you got to remember.
But the operating agreement is going to say how much it's going to be. And I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about in an operating agreement will say how much that social equity applicant's finances or their take home or their profit share would be.
But Chair, I guarantee, unless I'm missing something, again, if I'm putting up 95% of the money, I guarantee that operating agreement will not say that you who's putting up 5% of the money is getting the majority share of those profits.
And I'm not asking for it to say majority share.
Oh.
I'm asking for it to
just to see what it looks like.
Yes,
Oh.
and I'm asking for it to say shares. So let's be clear. I'm not unreasonable. I do understand that this social equity applicant, based on these criteria, probably doesn't have $4 million in the bank. We're not dumb and we're looking at all of it, right? But what I am going to say is I want to make sure that these applicants are share owners or profits, right? And I want to see that in operation agreement, not to say that it can't be manipulated because you're absolutely right, but we do need to have some kind of minimum criteria of what the expectation should be. If the minimum criteria starts at 20%, no less than 20%, I think that that's fair because it puts that person 20% of the shares or 20% of the profits, because it at least puts that person in a position that they aren't just being manipulated for their name. If that is what I'm saying has to be their minimum amount, they can negotiate up from there.
Right.
I believe it holds that investor accountable to that social equity applicant. I definitely am not for letting the market dictate. No, that is why we're here. What we want to do is put a program together that is unique and different than any other state because we have been allowed the opportunity to do that. We know what hasn't worked and we know what has. Here's an opportunity for us to do what someone else didn't. And I say, yes, let's define it. Let's define what we want to see in an operation agreement within reason.
Right.
So if with this social equity applicant came in on name only, because I'm sure that that's going to happen, his name is worth something. Right. Her name is worth something. And what is that value? I don't want to put a value on a person's name because, personally, I don't even like people not to use both my names. My name is Aisha Goins, not Aisha, not Goins, both. So to me, it's very valuable. But for the social equity applicant who is looking for this opportunity, what is the minimum amount that we believe that that operation agreement should say? I would say 20%. Actually, I'm going to say 25, but
I was going to go down, actually. It's not
And again, this is where we get arbitrary.
Yeah, because what's happening is, unfortunately, unless there's a funding source for people to tap into, you're going to have these problems like he's saying, and you're creating a barrier, because what's going to happen is, you know, I'm going to partner with people and they're going to say, you're going to get 20%, you're in social equity, but you might have to put in at least 20% of the funding. Because now I'm required to give you 20% of this company, because you're not only the social, and you couldn't do this without us, and we can't do this without you. So it's a partnership. When that happens, most likely, like we said, these applicants may not have the money to do that. And so then now they can't even partner. They can't even put a team together to do this, because they don't even have that 25% of whatever their business plan is. I just think, I was going to say 10% personally, but at a minimum, because of those barriers that I know. I've dealt with people trying to do this exact structure, and why, and all the reasons why. And mind you, some people don't mind being this person that's, we say, taken advantage of, but to them, it's an opportunity.
I mean, it's a person that's there for name only. Just to get,
but it's still an opportunity for them, and they will not have it, and they'll still take it, even though we don't want them to have to take it like that.
And then,
but is it an opportunity if they don't get any money and they don't get any shares?
Yeah, that's why we're putting
but I think you also,
a lower percentage.
I'm sorry, if you're going to look at the operating agreement, you've also got to make sure that that person has certain responsibilities and duties within the business.
Yeah, they should
not that just 20% and they're just hanging on the house.
I agree.
They actually have to be able to
control. The decision making.
Again, it doesn't really, like I said, 51% of ownership and then 20% or 10% of the profits, they don't match up. So I mean, if you're 51% owner, you should be getting 51% of the profits.
That's in a normal situation.
But no one's ever going to give you 50% of the profits if you've only put 5% of the money.
Exactly, and this
so
that's this kind of industry, which is unfortunate.
I mean, as far as I know, the CCB doesn't have a lot of. I mean, I know they don't have officers to go out and start inspecting these businesses and doing all this things.
But,
so we have to make sure that we aren't putting too much of a burden on them to have to regulate this. This is something where we probably just they want to agree, get the person in, fill the criteria, and then have the locals kind of monitor what they're doing on a regular basis, because they're not going to be able to do that.
I disagree.
The locals are not going to do the operating budget.
I disagree. They absolutely should be asking for an operation agreement. They absolutely have and are hired. They probably don't have enough people now, but they have been put in a position to hire people to regulate these facilities. And I'm looking forward to that. Congratulations to the CCB. But I'm not asking for them to regulate how the funds are being dispersed. What I'm asking is for us to decide what what the minimum requirements of an operation agreement would be based on this person qualifying for this establishment.
I say a minimum of 10%.
Okay.
You gotta have a minimum, and they can go up from there. That's my personal opinion.
I agree with that.
Okay.
Because I also want to just say this in full scope, is because if there isn't an operation agreement and we don't have a requirement, when this person sells, the social equity applicant, just like they came in with nothing, they leave with nothing. And so that is the full scope of what I want us to be looking at.
And I remember you talked about that at the last meeting. I heard when I watched the video. That's another issue with regard to selling it.
Yes.
So if the whole point is to have social equity operators,
we want to be
the person can't just sell it. I mean, they lose that status.
Well, there was a time frame, right? Like
2 years.
Yeah.
Also, to keep for these 2 years.
We keep in 2 years.
So again, at the end of 2 years, if all the social equity applicants funnel out, then you don't have any more social equity, because now it's the majority that's taking over.
They stay social equity licenses.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Even without a social equity person?
Right. So what will happen is, according to the policy, right, according to the way legislation has been written, they can sell after 2 years, and those that if they sell and that establishment is no longer a social equity establishment, that license is still a social equity license. So another social equity applicant can apply and then the process starts over.
But you're saying, but if they never sell the license, you're saying that a person who's not a social equity applicant can run the business until they decide to sell years
Yes,
later?
yes.
But isn't the whole point of it is to make sure that the industry is diverse? So like I said, after the first 2 years, all the social equity applicants funnel out, and now you've just got the majority, you've got people that aren't social equity applicants running these businesses forever. So it almost defeats the purpose of even doing this if you're gonna only have like a 2-year minimum requirement for them to own it. They should own it in perpetuity, and they should own it forever. That's the whole.
And if you don't let them sell that-
You don't just have social equity for 2 years.
No.
Social equity.
Your social equity period. However, we're talking about selling specifically, right? So
Right.
if you're talking about this social equity applicant is selling their license to someone that's a non-social equity applicant, that license still is a social equity application license and can be made available. Now, this is the big caveat, right? If there are establishment licenses made available, right? But that would stay a social equity social equity establishment. So that license will be available for a new applicant.
No, I understand that, but I'm just saying that it doesn't seem fair to keep calling it that, social equity applicant.
If after 2 years.
If in 2 years, the person who was the only social equity applicant funnels off or sells his interest or interest off, they should not still be a social equity business.
That establishment isn't a social equity establishment.
Well, the license is still a social.
No, the license goes back. That's what we're.
Oh, you mean it goes back to
the pot? Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So, but again, if I put 95% of the money in, you said leave in 2 years, I've now not recouped my investment. So who are you going to get to invest in a business that's going to cost?
Well, I'm hoping that you don't sell in 2 years.
Well, but again, we have the same thing with marijuana, the dispensaries and the labs. I mean, the number of labs we had and the number of production facilities we had was far greater in the beginning than it is now. And so people sell because competition is greater. They're not making any money. You have a family issue. There may be a number of reasons why you sell in 2 years. Some businesses fail in the first 2 years. 95% of businesses fail. So maybe it's not that high, but again, there may not be the money that they thought was going to be there in the beginning may not be there, and they may want to get out and cut bait now instead of putting good money after bad.
And because I have a question for you, because I just don't understand something you just said, and I just want to make sure. So you're saying to his scenario where the social equity person is out for whatever reason, the people that are in it still, or someone bought it
Right.
2 years later. You're saying that license goes back into the pot, but they still own it and run a lounge, but then a social equity license is available? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, let me be clear. This is just one interpretation of the policy, right?
Okay.
But according to the way I interpret, those licenses are always social equity licenses. And if that licensee that is a social equity license sells, then this person is no longer a social equity applicant. And this license is still a part of the Cannabis Compliance Board as a social equity establishment license.
So without that license, they can't continue to operate.
Well, they do have a license, but it's not a social equity one anymore.
But again, there's like 20 licenses.
Yes, Member Ullman.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think there's two different scenarios. So if they default or can't, run the business, then it would go back into the pot, which is what we spoke about last meeting. And then if they decided to sell after 2 years, they could sell to whoever they wanted to, I believe is what we discussed. And I do think, so two things on that. If somebody wants to sell after 2 years, and let's say they have made a great amount of money or want to do something else, it shouldn't stop them from selling that. And now they can make more money and continue to be a great business person. So I think we have to be careful on that. I think they should be able to sell whoever they want to. Now, if they did sell to another social equity applicant, we could possibly put some benefits in there, like reduce taxes, license, something to make it much more attractive to continue on helping other social equity applicants. But it only goes back into the pot if you
what it
default.
is right now. I'm trying to
But
understand.
again, you're only creating social equity for 2 years. So again, if this person decides this business isn't for them, it's not making money, and you sell it to whoever you want, that's not a social equity applicant, you've now destroyed a social equity. The whole purpose of this is to have a diverse population within this industry.
So
And if they sell within 2 years, you've destroyed that.
Because I think it's just a matter of interpretation, like, because this may not even be an issue.
For the next meeting, I'll put that down.
I just don't, I mean, if we're gonna have social equity, it needs to be in perpetuity. It can't just be for 2 years.
The license can't go back.
Right, it can't go back.
But then let's say that.
Okay, hold on.
Member Scott,
But
by limiting the applicants, the social equity applicants, to only sell to other social equity applicants, something to consider is, would you then be preventing that license holder of the consumption lounge from making more money? Maybe he or she got a bigger offer, but you're saying, no, you can only sell it to another social equity applicant. Instead, we make it attractive to try to continue the success of the social equity program, but we don't hinder that person to say, you can only sell it to another social equity applicant. Now you're hurting
But you're destroying the social equity program, because if you don't sell it to another person, you're now not diverse. If the whole purpose is to make this industry diverse, it's got to be diverse for longer than 2 years.
I agree. So let's consider this. There is a space where the policy suggests 2 years. We absolutely can ask for longer.
Again, if the whole purpose is to make this a diverse industry, you can't put a time limit on that. It has to be.
But we also don't want to pigeonhole these applicants into a place that may not be equitable for them, or it may not be sustainable for them. So
that's something that they think about when they open a business. I mean, that's something you think about when you open a business. You always think you're going to be. I don't think anyone goes into the business thinking they're going to fail. So I think that people are going into this thinking they're going to be successful. But again, we have to be realistic about the lounges. Unless you're, that's the thing we've struggled with at the city is, how do you make these profitable? And that's going to be up to a really good business owner to make sure that they have some kind of hook to keep people there. Be it, we have the paint and puff thing.
But we're not talking about profitability.
I know, but I'm just saying, Chair. But again, there's a bunch of different ideas that people talked about over the last 2.5 years when we were doing this, that there were great ideas to keep people involved and engaged. But I just think if your whole purpose is to keep diversity within this industry, you cannot just say that person has to be there for 2 years and they can funnel out, because I guarantee you'll have people that funnel out in 2 years and you'll no longer have diversity.
So what's your suggestion?
That you make it, if you're going to be a social equity, if this is going to be a social equity license, it always stays that way, meaning you have to then sell it to another social equity person or entity. You're going to destroy diversity if you don't do that.
I think you have to protect it some kind of way.
That's the only way to do it.
I like it. I don't want you to get the feeling that I'm not interested. I like it because it says sustainability. I am definitely for sustainability. I just didn't, I wanted to hear all of what you had to say before I weighed in. I like it. I think it's, I think the city's going to beat me up, but I like it. Yes.
One thing you could consider too is, if we allow those social equity applicants to sell to anybody, and let's say they sell to a non-social equity applicant, there is actually a new license created so that it doesn't go away and you don't hinder that current business owner from doing what they would like to do and selling to who they would like. So that would, I think, kind of solve that problem. Because I see your point, members.
Yeah, but then suddenly you have 40 lounges.
Agreed.
And that's the problem, because the legislature limited to 20.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's yeah.
So why don't we say this? Because I do believe I'm going to mention a compromise right now. I do believe it's unreasonable to hold people hostage to a license. There's not. Number two, I think there should be an opportunity for equity applicants to buy out, right? So here's what I'm thinking as a compromise. Maybe it makes sense to say that these social equity establishments are in a 10-year cycle, right? And a 10-year cycle basically says that within these 10 years, these investors and these members have to find social equity applicants to keep this in the social equity program. And then after that 10-year timeline, you can, whatever happens to the license. And maybe we should say 7 years because 10 is so kind of strenuous.
Like I said, you know, whenever I talk about diversity, it's like you just can't have it because it's now the hot topic.
I agree.
So you can't just say we're going to do it now and then 10 years from now we don't have social equity.
No, I agree.
So it has to be forever. And so I think it has to be a situation where, and again, they have to know that if you sell it, it's got to go to another social equity applicant.
Absolutely.
And depending on what money they put into it or whatever, again, they can convert it to something else, but I just don't like the idea of having to put a timeline on diversity.
Well, the reason why I'm saying it as in 10 years is because now this is a little strategic on my part, right? I'm saying 10 years because it allows lobbyists and legislators to work on how this would look long-term.
Right.
And it locks the program in while that's happening. That's the reason why I'm saying that timeline.
I do think it's important. If someone sells, that the social equity owner retains 51% of the profits if they do sell.
Well, the social equity.
But now you're getting into business structure.
Yeah, I'm going to think of this, but again, if I'm putting 95%, I'm certainly not going to give 51% of the profits.
Right.
But I think if we lock them in for, here's the reason, another reason why I'm saying 10 years is because I think if we lock them in for 10 years and they have to have a social equity applicant, then those persons who have been disenfranchised by the policy because of the drugs are now coming into a 2-year span where they could be the social equity applicant that someone's looking for.
Well, I'm with him on that
forever. They should be, again.
I'm not saying they shouldn't.
Or not that
if they have
social equity person.
Exactly.
So if this is the plan we wanted, this shouldn't have even been in the new legislation. They should have said, there's 20 of these, go for it.
I agree.
Because otherwise you're building diversity. You're getting people's hopes of the fact that there's going to be a system that's changed forever because for so long it's been the other way. Now you're going to change it back in 2 to 10 years.
I agree with you.
I agree.
I don't like the time frame,
and
I see what you're trying to do, but it doesn't mean that's going to happen like that. Unfortunately, you're outstanding. You do what you do because you care, but who knows what's going to be around in 5 years?
Right.
You care.
Right.
You might be president by then, and then we don't have anybody to fight.
Well, this is federal legislation. But like you said, I just think that, like you said, if we're putting a timeline on it, it's got to be.
So you just want to say forever?
It's a equal playing field forever. I mean,
okay.
It's social,
I don't disagree. So here's the thing. I don't disagree. I think it's a hard push.
It is.
But I'm going to write that down as something that we bring to the committee as a suggestion. And hey, forever.
It should be a social equity.
It maintains the social equity license forever. And if you can't, again, there's got to be somebody there that wants it. And if it isn't, I don't know what they're planning on charging for these licenses. Whether they'll have a real, whether you can even sell it, because there's certain licenses in the city you can't sell. It just goes back.
And this is another question for us to address another time or whatever. But what's the benefit of being a social equity license holder later?
Right.
Initially, there is, but there's no, and we can get into those programs later. But there needs to be that conversation, because what's the purpose of me holding on and trying to do this? I can
sell it 2 years.
And so there should be incentives put in place to keep those, whether that be tax breaks, this and that, because why would I care to get a social equity license?
Yes.
Right.
Even from you,
right.
Like buying it from you and keeping that status forever. That should be a benefit to the owner to sell it that way.
You're saying
again, if there's any, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
She said tax breaks. She was talking about
tax breaks that you're giving to a social equity applicant. Now that there aren't any, that person's still getting the tax, that entity's still getting the tax breaks.
Exactly. And so that's definitely not right.
Yeah. So let's talk about incentives in the next meeting, which is really soon. So we'll talk about incentives for investors in the next meeting. Let's move on to item number 6, which is applications fee reduction. And so according to legislation, we can offer up to 75% off of the current application fee, and I believe the application fee is like $5,000.
Now is that the state licensing fee and the local licensing fee?
Well,
Because we have a $5,000 fee non-refundable. So even if you didn't get it, you still had to pay us $5,000. You didn't get your $5,000 back. So.
this is
We need
the
you to waive that
application
for us.
This is the application fee to the Cannabis Compliance Board.
Oh, okay.
However, according to the policy, it says we can waive up to 75%. So the question is, it says qualifications.
Right.
This was my question. That's why it's on the agenda item. I think because we have criterias, those persons should qualify for this. However, because these are social equity applicants, I do want to consider what second tier would be, and second tier would be minority and veterans, right? Haven't not discussed that today, right now. However, if we don't find enough applicants with these first criteria, how do we feel about offering this first social equity applicant criteria the full 75% reduction?
I could hear my business licensing manager, Darcy, out of my heard in my ear right now saying, Brian, we have to, even though this is it's going to be a privileged license, we have to still do the same investigation, the same work as if this were not a social equity applicant. So therefore, the onus is going to be put on the jurisdictions to kind of foot the bill for those that are not paying the full
And
fee.
mind you, I think that I think you're worried about how many applicants you're going to get. I think you're not going to have to worry about that. There's going to be plenty of people with this criteria. You don't think so?
I agree.
So that being said, to his point, there's going to be hundreds, maybe thousands of applications to go through.
And also the policy was written, I do want to, and this is, policy.
Right.
The policy is written to buffer that expectation, to say that the current retail consumption loan licenses are paying $100,000 to what we would say to cover that. So with that in mind, Member Scott.
and it sure should cover that.
Well, Colorado's had this consumption lounge ordinance in their books. They have one. And so they have a coffee shop. And so I don't know how many applicants you get for this type of industry other than the people who have dispensaries now. Maybe you'd get the Paint and Puff, maybe you'd get a few of the other little ones, but they have one in all the years they've had it. So again, getting these on the ground are expensive, but I see what you're saying, because it's an impediment to getting into the industry that you have these exorbitant licensing or the application fees. 75% seems a little extreme, but.
I'm going to say 75%.
Okay, that's fine. No, that's fine.
I agree. I agree.
I didn't want to leave here today and get a phone call and they say you didn't let Member Scott talk. So I wanted to,
You don't get that phone call.
I think 75%. Member Ogden, what do you think?
I would say 50% up to 75.
But now we have to discuss the tier.
I guess, Chair, does the fee have to be $5,000?
The fee is in the policy. That is set.
Oh, yeah. So there's no changing that?
No.
Yeah, because we'd be talking about all the fees.
And so in that instance, so because you're doing, so would you require the locals to also give that same percentage? Because again, it works only I hear her voice in my head. So to require us to do that is putting the onus on the other local governments, because again, it's a privileged license, and not to bash the state, but we did a little bit more work than they did on vetting the licenses in the first round. So we really took a lot of work and time and effort to get that part of the work done, because they were within our jurisdiction and they had to be regulated by us and they had to be inspected by us. So we took a little bit more time to kind of go through the application process.
I appreciate the detail and Darcy, I know Darcy
Oh,
personally.
do you? Okay.
I've worked.
She's watching.
Yes.
So she said she was watching today.
Of course she is.
That's why our boys keep popping in there.
Yes, I appreciate the work and consideration. I know the city works extremely hard, and I know Darcy takes personal interest as it relates to the cannabis licensing.
Mhm.
But what I do want to say is that there is a buffer that's been put in place, and that's why this is a consideration.
Okay.
But to Member Ogden's point, I do think, considering our criteria, there could be a tier, and maybe the tier, it's 75% for most of these points, except for those persons who are immediate family members, and then theirs is 50.
Yeah, because that's why I went lower, because I'm like, it covers everybody,
Yes.
But if there's a tier, I can see that.
So 75% for all of the other criteria, except for family members, would pay the 50% of the fee.
Okay. But again, is that going to be for the locals as well?
Well, let me be clear. Every single person that should be applying for a social equity applicant should be a.
No, I'm sorry. The local jurisdiction, because we're gonna have a.
We're only talking about CCB.
I know,
So what y'all do over there has no relevance to what we doing right now.
Right.
Okay.
No offense, Ms. Darcy.
No. I understand.
You need
But
to have a
again-
meeting like this.
But again, yes.
Over there.
And we will. I'm assuming we will at some point.
I'm sorry, that was funny. That's funny.
But as it relates to
Gotcha.
the cannabis
So the state's
compliance
giving a
board,
discount.
yes.
Okay, gotcha.
75%.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
You
What do you think,
I
Member
don't want to get
Olden?
in trouble. I'm trying not to get in trouble.
Don't
And
get in
these
trouble.
people have my phone number too. They be calling me too.
Right.
Go ahead.
Don't get yourself in trouble on the first meeting, Member Scott.
I'm trying
know.
I'm already talking too much.
I think for the application being $10,000 for the independent lounges with the reduction of 25 is 100% fair. The fact that the dispensaries are having to pay $100,000 to apply to offset that cost, I think will prevent any hindrance, as you're suggesting, on the state. Also, I don't know if this is an option, but if there is an additional cost, is it possible to leverage any of the to leverage that with any of the money that we're getting from the federal government?
I don't know, but that doesn't have relevance on this right now. However, I absolutely, jurisdictionally, that doesn't have relevance on this right now, but there is some things in
relevance in the sense,
conversation with the jurisdictions.
Member Scott was worried, will that cover the cost, or will the, state institute have to incur that cost? I don't think they will, based on the dispensaries having to pay $100,000. I know that
Agreed.
the intent was to offset any additional costs. So overall, I agree, 2,500.
So the question is 75% for all of the criteria, and then 50% for those persons who would be family members. That's the question.
Yeah, if you're gonna put a reduction, I think a tiered system works better.
I say yes to that.
I say yes too.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And
yeah.
Chair, would we ask them if they have a current location that they're interested in pursuing, or would that, because again, without a location, the license does you no good. So, and I know you don't like brick and mortar, so.
No. What I was gonna say is, I'm gonna need you to turn off your city brain and come into a state brain.
I've been in the city for 25 years.
Yes.
That's all hard to do, so.
That is something that we will be discussing in the next meeting.
Okay.
I want to kind of trudge through some of this
Yes,
stuff,
gotcha.
but yes,
Okay.
that is one of the things that we will have to discuss.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah.
So moving on to item number 7.
Oh.
And this came directly from our public comment last meeting. And application stacking means that Member Ogden could put in 4 applications.
Sorry.
To maximize their opportunity to win. So I wanted to put this in here as one of the criterias. I wanted to make sure that we dialogued about this when it was brought up. When it was brought up in public comment, I made a note and I was like, I hadn't considered that. That is one of the bases of every other state being sued. It has been because of application stacking. Here's an opportunity for us to be forward thinking. So I am against this wholeheartedly, especially as it relates to social equity applicants. And these are the only thing that we have jurisdiction over right now in conversation. So for the social equity application program, I am going to say a hard no on application stacking. And furthermore, how can they application stack if we're considering that these persons wouldn't be sitting on so much money that they could stack applications? Because that's the idea, right? This isn't me saying that they're poor, but this is me saying that resources might be limited.
Everything, and he could apply for several.
Okay.
But do we want to make application stacking a criteria as one of the pass fails for applicants?
I think it's unfair. I don't think you should be able to have more than one application.
Agreed.
Again, especially if we're going to have lotteries are illegal in Nevada, but if you're going to have some kind of drawing at the end, you having 10 tickets in, me having 1 ticket in is.
I agree.
Can I ask this? How is it going to be set? Is it going to be like how the dispensaries were, where certain jurisdictions have certain amounts that they can give, and that? So if there's 10, Henderson gets 1, this gets 1. Is that kind of how it is? And then you have to decide ahead of time where you're going to apply and what jurisdiction, and in that only jurisdiction, that one application can, because that also needs to be considered in the sense of how you apply.
We won't. So I think that because we're going to be talking about that next meeting, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think that there's 10 applications. Mm-hmm. And I think with these 10 applications, they're going to kind of be arbitrary because it's 10 applications, and the new license, retail licensees
throughout the state.
Oh, okay. So the retail licensees will kind of already designate what's available because
they have to be in their location.
Exactly.
Right.
They have exactly. Mm-hmm. So it will be what is left if we're looking at it wholly. I do hear what you're saying. If we say that we can't have an application stacking, and we're saying that there's so many applications available, and somebody doesn't want to be in the city and someone doesn't want to be in the county, then they should be able to apply in the city and in the county. I do hear that, but there's 10 licenses.
Right.
Statewide.
Yeah, and see, because that's the only issue is why, and I get what you're saying, because I agree. I don't like it. It's really unfair in the grand scheme of things, but what happens is that, you might have 30 people applying in Henderson, and you might still want to turn your application there. You probably won't, the odds of getting it are very slim to none. Right. So you're like, let me go apply somewhere else just in case. I just want a license.
Well, the only thing in this, we called it the golden ticket. When you got your dispensary license, that was the golden ticket. And then you went to the jurisdictions and said, look, I got the golden ticket.
Yes.
Now here's my location.
Yes.
Here's where I want to go.
Yes.
And then they determined up or down where you went.
Yes.
So in this instance, 10 people get the golden tickets, then they go wherever they can find a location.
I agree.
You have to remember too that the number of locations where these will be allowed, first of all, you're going to have the not in my backyard people. Yeah. Then you have to be within 15, you can't be within 1,500 feet of a gaming license facility. Can't be within 300 feet of a school, church, synagogue. So the places where these are going to be located is going to be very limited.
I agree.
So,
and especially after we have already designated where the retail lounges will be. The space will be under
the spaces. I mean, there's very few places where you'll ever be able to get.
And you'll still have an obstacle of, like, let's say Henderson, for example, will say, we don't want it.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you've got to take those 10 people are fighting.
Yes.
Or let's say the city goes, well, we'll just take 2.
Yes.
Yes.
And now you're fighting, and you might even have a license with no place to go.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's there's things like that could happen. So we have to make sure
But that's the reason why I think application stacking is a no.
Right.
Is because I think you have the 10 applicants, and then after those 10 applicants have their, as Member Scott saying they have the golden ticket. It's up to them to do the lobbying and the footwork
Right.
to say where they're going to fit.
See, that structure I'm fine with.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
other one
Yeah.
where you can only apply in those jurisdictions.
Yes.
You have to pick it ahead of
Well,
time.
this is gonna be the state license, so you have the golden ticket for state.
Yeah.
And again,
Statewide
the
license.
one-
And just to clarify, you don't have to have an address.
You do not, yes, not to get the state ticket.
Application. And
Correct,
I have
correct.
one thing for us to consider, Chair Goins. What are your thoughts on social equity applicant being able to apply for both social equity and independent lounge?
So that to me isn't application stacking.
Yeah.
That's putting your name into, because social equity will be pass fail.
Right.
Independent will just be a pot.
Yeah, because it's still an
yes.
application, no matter how you slice that.
Yes.
Social equity piece is just one piece of the application.
Yes.
Okay, so
That's
social
pass
equity
fail. You
can
need to-
only apply for social equity. And then
Yes.
one other thing, just on the fees, let's say somebody applied for social equity and they paid the 2,500 and after being vetted, they were found out, not to qualify, giving those folks an option to pay the difference of the 10,000, paying the 7,500. So they're now moved over to the other pot. I want to be careful so
I
that.
don't want no part of that.
No.
I don't want no part of that.
Well, if I can finish my comment,
Yes.
So,
if I can finish my
Go
comment.
ahead.
So one thing we want to be careful is if somebody applies for a social equity application and they just miss it, they don't qualify for whatever reason, their crime, I don't know, whatever reason, it doesn't matter. We don't want to just say, you're out. You can still apply, but you have to go to this category. And I think that's important that we allow them to do that.
So Member Ullman, what I will say is one of the things that we are trying to be specific about is identifying who that social equity applicant is as a pass fail so that they already know where they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I don't want to do is get into a scenario where we are commingling the funds in an idea, because then that puts the CCB in a very weird space, and then it puts the program itself in a weird space.
But if they fail and we're just saying, you failed, now you can't apply for independent, I mean, that's not really fair to that applicant.
But I'm not saying you can't apply for independent. What I am saying is the independent program is its own program.
Sure it is. But again, if someone isn't a social equity applicant and they thought they checked all those boxes, yes. And then through vetting the process decided, unfortunately, you're not, but you are welcome to apply for the independent license. And, you can do that. That cost is $10,000. That's going to happen. We have to be prepared for that and be able to mitigate it. So
They have to pay the difference.
well, but the thing is, but the deadline to apply is exactly the same, right?
Whatever it is.
Are you planning on having, let's say, October 1 for all the social equity applicants, but then November or December 1 for all the other applicants?
No.
I mean, you're
And
gonna
my
run out of
question
history.
is-
So if you fail
and if
in
that's
that, in
not
that
the
first
answer-
instance, that's a social equity applicant,
And if
you're
that's
done.
not the solution, what do we do with those folks who thought they did everything right, went through the process, took the class, maybe even got an attorney, and then they find out through the vetting process, actually don't qualify. So again, we want to set people up for success. And if you didn't get a license on the first round, we want you to have the opportunity. And this is how we're going to do it. So I don't have the answer to that, just something I think we should discuss.
And let me ask you this just to go, because I don't even know if that's our issue right now to even determine. That's something the CCB, if they're scoring as a whole, they would say, okay, you didn't get these 5 points for social equity or pass fail, but then let me score the rest of your application.
Not score, sorry, we're not on that step yet, just the pass fail.
No.
So
the pass fail.
The chair, that means you'd have to allow the stacking. That means you'd have to apply as a social equity applicant and
No,
as a
that's
regular
not
applicant.
stacking.
The timeframes are exactly the same.
It's not.
So what he's
stacking,
saying,
it's-
so.
So it's
Member
saying
Ullman.
if you didn't qualify and you paid the $2,500, are we allowing those folks to then move their application to the independent lounges?
No.
And I think it should absolutely, you should be able to. Again, the point is to let people into this space that we're not.
Well, but that's
Member
a
Ullman.
social equity applicant.
So, Member Oman, what I will say is this is also the reason why we are discounting the application fee, because we do realize it's a risk and we do realize it's a stress to those applicants, but that's why the fee is being discounted so much, is to say, hey, we know that this is a risk, we know that you're taking it, and so here's a little oomph for that. I think as to what Member Scott says, I think it makes the waters a little muddy. And what we want to do is, and I agree, there's going to be space where people thought they qualified, and maybe there needs to be a program where we can pre-check people to see if they're qualified. Maybe, that's something one of the progressive movements out there could do, is say, hey, you know what? We'll pre-check your qualifications before you go into the application process. I think that's a great program that someone could do. It ain't gonna be me because I got some other programs to do. That's why I'm putting it out there. But I think that's a great program that someone could put in place. But when you do business, doing business it's a risk. And the unfortunate part is this is a component of the risk. And that is the reason why there is a reduction in fees for that risk.
Yeah, you can't hold everybody's hand to what they should be doing as a business owner. If they can't fill it out, they didn't know, that's the risk look, they might miss a board member on the application too. You're going to let them go back and fill that out? No, it just doesn't, next time you got to apply it and follow.
So if you did it wrong, you're out.
Well, that's the way it was.
That's what it is everywhere else. Like that's everything in life. Like you got to get you a consultant, make sure whatever it is that people need to do to get their application right.
That's why I think the criteria have to be as clear and concise as possible, because if they're subject to interpretation, they are going to Member Ullman said, they're going to think they qualify and they don't.
Yes.
That's why the criteria have to be crystal clear.
Yes.
And there is no kind of gray area.
And I think the suggestions we will make to the CAC to vote on are clear criteria. I think that they're easy to identify. I don't think I'm looking forward to seeing what this looks like. Member Ullman, you brought up a great question, a great suggestion. And I can appreciate the empathy given. And although I am completely empathetic, I also am a business owner. And there's a fee to doing business.
Fine line.
And to Darcy watching this, they raised my fees recently to doing business. But it's part of doing business. As we're moving into item number 8 on the agenda, future meetings. We do have a future meeting already on the books. I believe it's the
4th, I believe. October 4th.
October 4th. Is the 3rd or the 4th?
It's the 4th, I believe.
October 4th. So we will be back here next week because I'm trying to make sure that, we get done what we need to get done. We made great headway today. I appreciate everyone's time. And it is now, yes, sir.
What's your deadline for actually putting in the suggestions to the CCB?
The CAC.
Or CAC, yeah.
The CAC is supposed to be meeting in a few weeks, as far as I know.
Okay.
And you said our focus next time should be incentives.
Yes, we want to talk about incentives. And give me a
And in
second.
the interim, Chair, can we get a copy of the application? We've been trying to find a copy of the application so we can see if there's any other criteria we want to list for the lounges.
Absolutely. And we also want to, so the next meeting, we'll be talking about the diversity component of the application as it relates to women and veterans. And
are we going to do disabled as well?
yes, women,
LGBTQ,
disabled, LGBT,
okay.
yes. We'll be talking about how that looks for second tier. And then also incentives for investors and or future applicants. And I had one more thing. I have notes everywhere, so give me 1 second. Oh, And I want to make sure that we can identify those disproportionate areas. So I'm going to try to get a study done so that we can have that ready to dialogue, what we're really looking at so that we're clear on that.
And Chair, that's only going to be one factor in the overall scoring of the applicant.
That would be a pass-fail. So what we said is, so what we said is 5 years in these areas.
Yes.
So that's what I'm going to identify as those areas.
And how many failures can you have before your application's gone?
Well, only one of these would call. If you hit one of these, you can qualify.
But if you hit one fail, okay. So if you hit one pass, you qualify?
Yes.
Oh, you don't have to meet every criteria.
No.
Okay.
That's what I was considering.
Yeah.
Right?
The only one I was questioning is the family member. Do they have to live? Because I thought someone said they maybe live in those areas, their family member lived in those areas. So there might be a layer there, but other than that, there was not that I saw.
Okay, yeah. And what we said was an immediate family member that lived in that disproportionate area for 5 years, for that same amount of time.
Or did conviction, I think that, or something. You guys were talking about? It was just that disproportionate.
Okay.
So we're going to give somebody a preference that has a family member that lives in a disproportionate area, but not if they were affected by cannabis policy? Is that what you're saying?
No, we're saying the same thing. One of the criteria is 10 years out of a felony conviction, cannabis policy conviction, any misdemeanor at any time cannabis conviction. That also a person who lives in a 5-year disproportionate area, a person who is 51%. So they have to be, this is a criteria on top. They have to be a 51% social equity applicant. And then also a person who is an immediate family member of a person who was disenfranchised by the war on drugs based on them having a misdemeanor or a felon, but lived 5 years in a disproportionate area.
Gotcha. And
So
it can
we
be
just kind of
anywhere in the United States they lived in a disproportionate area as long as they've lived in Nevada for 5 years?
No, they have to be living in Nevada for the same criteria for the 5 years applies to that immediate family member. Because we're being consistent.
Okay, but they have to live in Nevada in a disproportionate area. So they couldn't
For
have
5
lived in another state in a disproportionate area. Now they're a grown adult. Now they live in the suburbs. Then they wouldn't qualify, is what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I guess we have, we're going to have to check all these criteria to make sure that they're actually telling the truth. So I don't know how much investigative power or ability we have to see if someone was in Chicago and lived in a disproportionate area. So I think it's easier. Again, we need to put something easy for the CCB.
Yeah, that's why this is. That's why this is the easiest. Yeah. And then plus we're already saying because one of our questions was, if you're a family member, how do we funnel that to make sure that we don't have everybody? This is what we've decided to stay consistent. All right. Before we open it up to public comments, does any of the members have any final comments? All right, then we're going to move to agenda 9 and public comment. We're going to I'm going to ask that you keep your comments at 2 minutes. And I do want to say this, because I'm not being rude when I say last 30 seconds, final comments. I just want to offer you an opportunity to kind of sum up what you're trying to say with your last 30 seconds. But I do have a timer here. So if everybody's wondering how am I keeping time, I have a timer here. So that's how I'm keeping time. But I'd like for you to state your name, limit your comments to 2 minutes. Please come to the public comment podium. And this is your time for public comment.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for your time. Thanks for putting this together. I got into this industry out of necessity for medicine in 2008. And there was nothing clean here in Nevada back then, and there was no safe access. And so as I worked with more and more patients, it became necessary that I expanded and grew. And I was super excited for the licenses to get a dispensary in 2014 and 2015. And I was working with groups where I was going to be their cannabis expert and become an owner. Prior to that, unfortunately, I was raided by a federally funded task force here in Nevada. And those conversations ended abruptly. And while the state tried to figure out what they're going to do with me for 3 years, and then they finally charged me with a simple misdemeanor possession charge, that opportunity was taken from me. I made something of myself in this industry. I've created hundreds of jobs in this state, but one thing I haven't been able to do is participate in a license. And so what I'm asking for is that you put the priority on those whose justice was taken away here in the state of Nevada, who sacrificed their freedoms and their liberties to lay the foundation for the medical marijuana market that so many now benefit from.
Can you state your name?
Chris Repentish.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Hello, hi. Good afternoon, Chair. My name is Timothy Eliotto, for the record. I'm speaking on behalf of Kimo Vario Startup. And just to keep the comments briefly, I wanted to start by stating that the reason we're here is social equity. And given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward social equity. That's the reason we're here. We're here because during NRS 453A, at some point, we had a system that disproportionately marginalized certain individuals from this industry. Some of us, like the gentleman just have stated, we could prove that during the early stages of this industry, I was the first person of color to have applied. We help cannabis patients gain techniques of growing, providing medicine for patients. We helped drawing the early draft of the 2013 bills. Well, some people were in here when that happened. So we know exactly what it took for us to get to where we are right now. This is not a laughing matter. This is serious because we know what it took to get here. Unfortunately, for some people, being a lobbyist, you would have to disclose what your interests really are in this position that you're playing right now. And I'm going to speak on this. We are the only state that is moving forward with a consumption lounge business model for social equity. That's a shame. Why? Because we have a system that does not provide any, profitable model. It's not proven. So why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing exactly what other states are doing? Path to ownership, because we help establish those facilities. What are we doing here? What is it in for you? What is it in it for you?
Last 30 seconds, sir.
I'm here to acknowledge that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
My name is Katrie Saunders, for the record, and I'd just like to establish I don't have a residency. I've been displaced for the past 2.5 years for Nevada State Legislature's bad policy, for federal legislation's bad policy. So when you guys are putting requirements on residency, I don't even have a home to provide where I've been for the past 2 years. My kid's father is displaced. He moved my kids to another state because he didn't want to have to deal with the federal government and the things that were going on with Nevada State Legislature. So with him being my ex, he's not eligible because he doesn't live in the state. My son had to go to the Air Force. He just moved back. He wouldn't be eligible. The 10-year requirement for people having been affected by the war, I wouldn't be involved because I'm only 7 years out of my felony from being out of prison. So first and foremost, if you guys are discussing social justice and social issues, there needs to be a special session to address that law first and foremost, if you guys are really planning on making an impact on the harms that have been done at a state level and at a federal level. There also needs to be a real pathway to ownership. I can attest I worked in the industry, when I worked at the Source, they were building out lounges so that they could have social consumption. Social equity language was only added as an afterthought to make it look like you guys were actually trying to do something for those most harmed. If you guys are actually trying to do something for those that are most harmed by the war on drugs, there would be ownership, discussion of cultivations, dispensaries, labs, ancillary businesses, et cetera, and there's no discussion of that. This was set up primarily for existing operations who are already in ownership and who have already spent the money to be built out for social equity lounges. So I'm asking for a special session to be called for first and foremost to address the 10-year clause, because this can't go on. If you guys are really serious about social justice and making a blueprint for the rest of the nation to follow, that needs to be addressed first and foremost before anything goes on. And my name is Katrina. I'm done speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Lee. I have just a few comments and suggestions as well. I am who you're speaking of. I've been here since 1985, and I was raised up in Herbert Gerson Park. At the age of 19, I was with a friend, and some FBI agents or police officers came in and put a charge on me. And it was a drug trafficking charge, and I never sold drugs in my life. It's not a secret here that in Nevada, a lot of African American people were put charges on. And even if I didn't go to prison, that charge affected my name. So when I went to go look for jobs, they saw that, even though I did not commit that crime. So you might want to keep that in consideration when you say that the person have to have been in prison. Because even though I did end up working for the state of Nevada for Department of Child and Protective Services, it took a long time for me to get there. Because any employer that saw that fake charge on my name turned me away. So it took a long time for me to get established. Second of all, someone was mentioning about the 75% or 2 or 50%. If we're looking at social equity and you're looking at people who may not have the money, and we're talking about this as a program for people who may not have the money, that should not be something to be argumentative about, especially if there's an option to say, well, maybe they don't qualify for the 75%, but let's give them 50% off or 25% off. But to pinpoint a number to maybe 25% or 50% is ridiculous. Also, a suggestion, if there is an applicant and they are able to get into the program, but they have to sell off. Why not sell off to the CCB? Why the CCB not buy it, or why not have the people who are able to get on this program to say, hey, we're going to give you this application, but hey, if you're making profit, you need to put some profit back into the program that got you established. How about, hey, you're getting a certain amount of money, you got to put in 2% for the next person to come behind you and put into that pot, because you got a hand up, so now put your hand back and reach for somebody else. That's an option. I mean, if something that you might want to look into. And then also the process, like the Queen said there, Las Vegas is known now that it's getting a little bit more diverse. For people that's been here for a long time, knows the history of Las Vegas, that we weren't even allowed to go to the Strip.
We're past time.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Please have your last comments.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all I have to say. I'll be back again to make more comments, and I thank you for establishing this opportunity for us. Thank you.
I just wanted to briefly say a couple things from the discussion that was going on earlier. I think there was a lot of questions about social equity and, you know, how you guys verify that all the information and this and that. I've worked on a lot of social equity programs in different states, and I know none of them really work, but one thing that a lot of the states do is they pre-qualify people for social equity before they even submit an application. So you can submit for the pre-qualification, submit all the required documentation to provide, whether it's you're requiring them to show like utility bills to prove their residence or their bank statements or lease deeds or whatever, all that can be uploaded, via internet and they can get that pre-qualified so that what the lady was mentioning earlier, what if they spend the $2,500 and then they find out they're not qualified for social equity? This can kind of bypass that whole scenario so that people can be pre-qualified at the time and know that they qualify for the social equity program. Things like that. Another thing I wanted to say is requiring people to have financials. Social equity people, to me, that's almost discrimination. They should be able to get that provisional license and then go raise the money they need. You're only giving out 10 licenses. Those licenses are going to be super valuable. I know you guys say that, and we knew a lot of people are saying that the consumption model is, we don't know if it's profitable, if it's not profitable. Well, you got people with millions and millions of dollars who want to open up consumption lounges here. It's not going to be hard for these people to raise money as soon as they get that license. Like you said, they're going to have the golden ticket. So they're going to go around. It's a lot easier for someone who's a social equity candidate to now say that I got the license, now I have something to stand on so I can raise funds. So I'm not getting a predatory loan from somebody anymore because now I have it. But if you require me ahead of time to go try to get the financials and the financing, I could be subject to whatever those guys' terms are.
Final comments.
So that was basically it from the conversation from what we were talking about earlier. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Bondis, for the record. First, I want to thank the commission, all of its members, and the chair for hosting such a gracious meeting here and allowing us to have this opportunity to come and speak of these matters. I do feel it's been a long time coming. I will make this short and as non-emotional as possible for all the committee members to hear. I know of a gentleman, born of an immigrant mother, not speaking English, raised in the United States, learning the way of life along with his mother, including the language. Fighting his way, coming from the States back to a foreign country to do much of his schooling and then returning in high school, even more removed from normal lifestyles. This individual chose to get into cannabis out of necessity for medicine, out of necessity for funds, out of necessity for life in an environment that was not meant for this particular individual. Moving through cannabis in his life, you become a criminal no matter what. It's a decision you have to make. It's a vow of absolute shadow living, and that's something that you have to do. This individual made that decision throughout his life to live in the shadows. Throughout all of this time, developing, learning, structuring much of what we use today. The example I like to give is the eighth. The eighth is still designed based on the $50 from the underground. This, we didn't come up with a new price. So some of these things were captured by that group of individuals. This particular individual took it a step further into access during the gray areas of our Nevada law. Remember, grow your own. Not everybody can grow their own. So this individual took the time to try and develop a system to work within these individuals to get them access in every way that he possibly could, getting with groups and finding a way to work within these gray laws in order to create that access.
Final comments.
Within that time, this individual was raided and spent 4.5 years fighting a case. Within that 4.5 years at the end, Nevada switched its laws to what we're using today. But within that 4.5 years, 2 years of being smeared all over media, not being able to get a regular job, much less apply here, that individual was never given a chance. That individual is now an executive working at a high level for an MSO, still never going to be promised a seat at that table. I am that individual. And I just want to thank you guys for giving us not only public comment, but for taking the time to discuss how that program is going to be designed for people like myself, who for a very short period of time were made from being a criminal to valuable.
Thank you.
We'd love for that value to come. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Is there no more public comment?
I have one last thing to add.
Can I hear 2 minutes? I'm going to give you just 30 seconds.
No, I just want to add, I was affected by the war on drugs at an early age. My real father got incarcerated when I was 12 for selling cannabis at the post office. I believe he worked there. So I've had to deal with this from a child onto adulthood. So I'm just wanting that real justice gets served in the state of Nevada, that we have real laws and a real blueprint that the rest of the nation can follow. And my name is Katrina, I'm done speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate everybody's time. You know, it is my absolute pleasure to serve my community. You know, I don't have to do this work. I get to do this work. It's tedious work. It's tiring work. But where else would I do? What else would I do? I'd still do this. So thank you for your time. The meeting is adjourned. See you on October 3rd.